World as I See It by Albert Einstein. This is not a book about science. It is about responsibility and how a thinking mind meets the world. Listen closely.
Preface. I seem to have been only like a child on the seashore, amusing myself by finding now and then a smoother pebble or a more graceful shell than usual, while the great ocean of truth was still unexplored before me. Isaac Newton, Brewster's Memoirs. Remo Values. Eternal Science and Science of Men. The myth that most fascinates man, who always returns to it with innocent fables, with the fantastic tales of revealed religions, with metaphysical science, is that of the lost earthly paradise, of the fabled Golden Age. An age without time and perhaps without space, in which man was immersed in everything and understood things and all beings. But if the myth is truly fascinating, it seems to overshadow, even in the minds of the greatest, a kind of dull resentment against the weight, even if clear and distinct but tormenting, of a knowledge dramatically based on human reason, founded in turn only on itself and its history. Is it the desire to seize the keys to eternal science, as Faust cried out? To seize once and for all the absolute science, to grasp the universe in its immutability? And thus, in a sense, while having the way to manufacture more machines and reach other planets and perhaps other solar systems, put our reason to rest instead. This mystical metaphysical ambush of our intellect, absit injuria verbis, strangely reminds us at the same time of Plato's Hyper-Urania, a bemillenary target almost never hit by humorists, and of the ambush of the cheeks, of the young woman who assures us the continuation of the species. What I mean is that even if it is very dangerous as a theoretical approach, it has an enormous practical value that no one can deny, much less ignore. What does it matter, in fact, if tomorrow these formulas that today frame the world and close it in the grip of their closed circle will then be seen as illusory, or at least limited? Now they are the whole truth. Now they serve us well. As Ptolemy's astronomy once served us to guide our ships, as Ramon Lull's alchemy and Paracelsus' magic served us, and again, as the Copernican system and Galileo's and Newton's physics served us. In this lie the greatness and the drama of thought. In continually grasping the truth and seeing it continually escape in the search for a truer truth, for a reality that is even more real, which will find, infinitely, other truer truths and other more real realities. Science, with its objective discoveries, with its achievements, is a great part, but only a part of the history of our thinking. Mathematics is a science in which you do not know what you are talking about, and you do not know whether what you are saying is true. These are the words of Bertrand Russell, a distinguished contemporary mathematician. Is it a simple ironic paradox, or does it have a basis of truth? Let us see its two sides. First, numbers are free creations of the human spirit, and therefore they, and all mathematical truths, have no value outside our own thought. Mathematics is neither true nor false, because this truth or falsehood of its concepts depends only on our deliberation to accept, or not to accept, the hypothesis from which they are deductively derived. Can a science that is systematically based on hypothesis tell us the truth? The mathematical world is therefore governed by our will, and if mathematical concepts are universal, they are not, however, concrete, because they ignore the reality of things and are empty of any representative content. We put symbols in the place of things to be numbered, but can substituting a symbol for the thing make us better acquainted with it? Simia Philosophiae was also called mathematics and promoter of superstition, are not in fact loaded with metaphysical fogs in the great Newton the concepts of time and space that he considers as absolute as censors of God. And Lorentz, who also introduces us to the theory of relativity, does not he too consider the constant speed of light as an absolute, as a sort of ray that starts from the divine eye? A kind of unattainable mysteries. We have confined ourselves for brevity to only two illustrious examples closest to the theory of relativity. Even space and time are conceptual fictions, constructions of the intellect, and they are no longer even considered as forms of intuition. Intuition, the philosopher tells us, is devoid of any spatial and temporal determination. And then, the question of the famous dimensions of space? The philosopher answers, since space is a conceptual fiction, the dimensions, 1, 2, 3, 4, n dimensions, are not inherent to spatiality, but depend only on the arbitrary rule that is established to follow in determining it. In fact, Einstein himself speaks of his uncertainty in attributing to space 4 or more dimensions, and of having finally decided for the 4-dimensional one because it was the most practical. Some mathematicians have also constructed a fractional degree field theory, in which the number n of dimensions of space can have fractional values. This strongly amazed, as Albergamo reports, the devisers themselves, but not the philosopher. He who has to do with pure vacuity can do anything he wants. Therefore, the project of a mathematical science of nature is absolutely inexecutable, and therefore such a science is to be considered for its impracticality, not as an ideal of the sciences of nature, as their end and their soul, but as an illusion and a mirage, which can never be implemented even partially, because the empirical concept cannot be converted into mathematics, if not by canceling precisely its empirical character, its qualitative concreteness. The marvelous harmony of the universe, the very possibility of understanding it rationally, are nothing but harmony of our spirit, which irresistibly tends to coordinate chaos. The child, or primitive man, when he first acquires self-awareness, regulates the chaotic world of things inside and outside according to the laws of the spirit, the rules of his organs. Everything, evidently, even the most scientific experience. Man ineluctably projects all his spirit into the universe as far as he can investigate and penetrate it, so that, in a certain sense, it can be said that great scientific research, like art, is the autobiography of the human species, that is, the history and deepening of ourselves, which differs from art only in that the latter is the autobiography of humanity in its individual yet universal persons, while science is the autobiography of the species. The all is neither space nor time but history, are the words of a relativistic physicist, Whale. Second phase. But the philosopher must recognize, somehow one begins to count by adding, subtracting, not only in the arms of the wet nurse, but in the very instant one has begun to live. One cannot not calculate so much that one always calculates, and by all. Not only that, but mathematizing is not proper to men, but to all beings who have a minimum of spiritual glimmer. Thus do birds, dogs, and insects arithmeticize when they seek, for example, a house, or the spider when it constructs its web in perfect geometrical figures. And the same plants. Who has not observed, for example, the acrobatics of climbing plants to grasp a valid support? Or, in a simpler and more general way, the conscious contortions of any plant in search of light, of humidity. And finally, why not? microscopic unicellular organisms that seize their prey and live and move according to their own plan. The scientist, relying on the persistence and universality of mathematics, affirms that it is objective not only of our spirit, but of matter, and that therefore nature is truly written in triangles, circles, spheres, cones, pyramids, and other mathematical figures, Galilee, and that indeed this is its true and only language, the language even of the proton-neutrons. Besides, didn't the philosopher and great mathematician Leibniz postulate that the monads, that is the simplest and even inextended substance, which constitutes the structure of the universe, something like, just to make it clear, our proton-neutrons, were thinking and mathematizing things? If, then, the pretended abstractness of mathematical formulas were true essentiality, if it were not essential to imply the multiple contingent individual reality, and what if things and life itself were numbers, that is, mathematical ratios of a very high mathematics, of which we would only glimpse a few elements for now, and in which, therefore, all the phenomena of life would not find a place in relative freedom? Birth, love, hate, thought, death, and birth again? We would understand the universe in its true essence outside of intellectualistic schemes. The laws of our mathematical reason would be identical to those that govern the universe, the physical real. The inner reality of our mathematical thinking would be the model of absolute reality. We would resolve the universe within ourselves without noumenal residue, and we would govern it from within. We are entitled, Einstein says, to be convinced that nature is the realization of what can be imagined to be mathematically simplest. The purely mathematical construction allows us to discover these concepts that give us the key to understanding natural phenomena and the principles that bind them together. And he adds, I also believe in the possibility of a mathematical model of reality, that is, a theory that presents the things themselves and not only the probability of their appearance. And again, the general laws that serve as a basis for the constructions of the theoretical physicist's thought have the pretension of being valid for all natural events. Basing ourselves on them and making use of rigorously logical deductions, we should arrive at a rigorously exact image. That is, a theory of natural phenomena, including those of life. It is clear that Einstein's theory of relativity is first and foremost a scientific theory, and that one does this doctrine a disservice by trying to convert its data too immediately into philosophical and metaphysical results. But it is also clear that the theory of relativity reproposes, albeit indirectly, but with vivid topicality, capital problems of knowledge-inducing philosophers, and what is much more significant as the character of an epoch, scientists as well, to new and deeper philosophical approaches to those problems. Isn't the long road that leads to the formulation of the theory of relativity all made up of experiences, reflections, and philosophical achievements? And if on the one hand scientists such as Maxwell, Lorentz, Riemann, Ricci, Minkowski contribute to it, on the other hand, as Einstein himself acknowledges, the highly original thought of the Greeks and Italiots of southern Italy and Sicily, such as Pythagoras, Protagoras, Democritus, Empedocles, Archita, and finally the thought of Descartes, Kant, and Schopenhauer, contribute to it. Science and philosophy return to constitute an ideal duality, united and yet distinct, each in its own office. We believe that in particular the theory of relativity and, above all, the centuries-long struggle to formulate it can be a powerful stimulus for the culture of our country to broaden its philosophical and therefore practical horizons. Because, and this should be obvious by now, the life of a people as well as the life of individuals, even of the most uncultured and disdainful of philosophy. Vulgar skepticism is also a way of philosophizing, is conditioned by their vision of the world, however crude it may be, and by the method that they, perhaps unconsciously, adopt to face it and make it their own. Society and personality. If we consider our existence and our endeavors, we note at once that all our actions and desires are bound up with the existence of other men, and that by our very nature, we are similar to animals living in community. We eat food produced by other men, wear clothes made by others, inhabit houses built by the labor of others. Most of what we know and believe has been taught to us by others through a language that others have created. Without language, our faculty of thinking would be very mean and comparable to that of the higher animals. Therefore, our priority over the animals consists, first of all, it must be confessed, in our way of living in society. The individual, left alone from his birth, would remain in his thoughts and feelings similar to the animals to a degree very difficult to imagine. What the individual is, and what he represents, is not as an individual, but as a member of a large human society that guides his material and moral being from birth until death. The value of a man for the community in which he lives depends above all on the extent to which his feelings, his thoughts, and his actions contribute to the development of the existence of other individuals. In fact, we are in the habit of judging a man good or bad according to this point of view. The social qualities of a man appear on first meeting him, the only ones that are valuable in determining our judgment of him. Yet even this theory is not strictly accurate. It is not difficult to understand that all the material, intellectual, and moral goods received by society have come to us in the course of countless generations of creative individualities. The one of today is an individual who discovered at once the use of fire, an individual who discovered the cultivation of nutritive plants, an individual who discovered the steam engine, spiritual freedom of individuals, and social unity. And yet only the free individual can meditate and consequently create new social values and establish new ethical values through which society is perfected. Without creative personalities capable of thinking and judging freely, the development of society in a progressive sense is just as unimaginable as the development of the individual personality without the enlivening aid of society. A healthy community is therefore linked as much to the freedom of individuals as to their social union. It has been said with much reason that Greek European American civilization, and in particular the flourishing of culture in the Italian Renaissance, which took over from the stagnation of the Middle Ages in Europe, found its foundation above all in the freedom and relative isolation of the individual. Let us now consider our age. What is the state of society and personalities today? In comparison with the past, the population of civilized countries is extremely dense. Europe contains about 3 times as much population as it did 100 years ago. But the number of men endowed with a genial temperament has diminished without proportion. Only a small number of men, because of their creative faculties, are known to the masses as personalities. To a certain extent, organization has replaced the qualities of genius in the field of technique, but also, and to a very considerable extent, in the field of science. The shortage of personalities is especially felt in the artistic field. Painting and music are nowadays clearly degenerated and evoke much less intense echoes among the people. Politics is not only lacking in leaders. Intellectual independence and the feeling of right have been profoundly diminished in the bourgeoisie, and the democratic and parliamentary organization that rests on that independence has been disrupted in many countries. Dictatorships have arisen and have been endured because the feeling of dignity and right is no longer sufficiently alive. Decay of human dignity. The newspapers of a country can, in 2 weeks, bring the blind and ignorant mob to such a state of exasperation and excitement that men will put on military dress to kill and be killed in order to enable unknown businessmen to carry out their ignoble plans. Compulsory military service seems to me to be the most shameful symptom of the lack of personal dignity from which our civilized humanity is suffering today. In relation to this state of affairs, there is no shortage of prophets who predict the imminent collapse of our civilization. I am not one of these pessimists. I believe in a better future. The economic system hinders free evolution. In my opinion, the present social decadence is due to the fact that the development of economics and technology has severely exacerbated the struggle for existence, and thus the free evolution of individuals has been dealt a severe blow. But in order to satisfy the needs of the community, the progress of technology today demands of individuals far less activity. The rational division of labor will become an ever more imperious necessity and will lead to the material security of men. And this security, together with the time and energy that will remain available, can be a favorable element in the development of personality. In this way, society can still heal, and we would like to hope that future historians will present the pathological manifestations of our time as the infantile diseases of a humanity with mighty aspirations, caused by the too rapid rush of civilization. Social value of wealth. I am firmly convinced that all the riches of the world could not push humanity further forward, even if they were in the hands of a man totally devoted to the evolution of mankind. Only the example of great and pure personalities can lead to noble thoughts and noble actions. Money only arouses selfishness and always leads irresistibly to the misuse of money. Can you imagine Moses, Jesus, or Gandhi armed with Carnegie's bag? Why do we live? The situation of us mortals is quite unique. Each one of us is on this earth for a short visit. He does not know why, but very often he thinks he has understood it. We are here for other men, first of all for those on whose smiles and well-being our happiness depends, but also for that multitude of strangers to whose fate we are bound by a bond of sympathy. Here is my constant thought of every day. The exterior and interior life depends on the work of contemporaries and on that of predecessors. I must endeavor to give them, in equal measure, what I have received and what I still receive. I feel the need to lead a simple life, and I am often painfully aware that I am asking more of the activity of my fellow men than is necessary. I realize that differences of social class are not justified, and that, after all, they find their foundation in violence. But I also believe that a modest life is suitable for anyone, for body and spirit. Limits of our freedom. I do not at all believe in human freedom in the philosophical sense of the word. Everyone acts not only under the impulse of an external imperative, but also according to an inner necessity. Schopenhauer's aphorism, "It is certain that a man can do what he wants, but he cannot want what he wants," has strongly impressed me since my youth. In the whirlwind of events and trials imposed by the harshness of life, those words have always been for me a comfort and an inexhaustible source of tolerance. Being aware of this contributes to softening the sense of responsibility that easily mortifies us and prevents us from taking ourselves and others too seriously. One is thus led to a conception of life that gives a singular place to humor. well-being and happiness. From an objective point of view, worrying about the meaning or purpose of our existence and that of other creatures has always seemed to me absolutely empty of meaning. Nevertheless, every man is bound to certain ideals that serve as a guide in action and thought. In this sense, well-being and happiness have never appeared to me as the absolute goal. I call this basis of morality the ideal of pigs. The ideals that have illuminated my path and constantly given me gallant courage have been goodness, beauty, and truth. Without the consciousness of being in harmony with those who share my convictions, without the anxious search for the right, eternally elusive, the domain of art and scientific research, life would have seemed absolutely empty. Since my youth, I have always considered despicable the vulgar goals to which humanity directs its efforts, the possession of goods, apparent success and luxury. A horse that pulls itself. In singular contrast to my ardent sense of justice and social duty, I have never felt the need to get close to men and society in general. I am like a horse that wants to pull alone. I have never given myself fully to the state, or to the land of my birth, or to my friends, or even to my closest relatives. On the contrary, I have always had the distinct feeling of being a stranger in the face of these ties, and I have always felt the need for solitude, and this feeling has only increased with the years. I feel strongly, but without regret, that I touch the limit of understanding and harmony with my neighbor. Of course, a man of this character thus loses a portion of his candor and serenity, but he gains from it a wide independence of the opinions, habits, and judgments of his fellow men. Nor will he be tempted to establish his balance on so shaky a basis. Everyone must be respected. My political ideal is the democratic ideal. Everyone's personality must be respected, and no one must be idolized. For me, the precious element in the machinery of humanity is not the state, but the creative and sensitive individual. In short, the personality. It is this alone that creates the noble and the sublime, while the masses are foolish in their thinking and limited in their feelings. War. This subject leads me to speak of the worst of all creations, that of the armed masses, of the military regime, which I hate with all my heart. I deeply despise those who are happy to march in the ranks and formations following a music. This one only by mistake has received a brain. A spinal cord would be more than sufficient for him. It is necessary to suppress this shame of civilization as quickly as possible. The commanded heroism, the stupid hand-to-hand combat, the nefarious nationalist spirit, how I hate it all, and how ignoble and despicable war seems to me. I would rather be willing to be cut to pieces than to take part in such a miserable action. And yet, in spite of everything, I esteem humanity so much that I am convinced that this evil ghost would have long since disappeared if the common sense of the people had not been systematically corrupted through the school and the press by the speculators of the political and business worlds, religion and science. Meaning of life. What is the meaning of our existence? What is the meaning of the existence of all living beings in general? To know how to answer such a question is to have religious feelings. You will say, but does it make sense to ask this question? I answer you. Whoever believes that his own life and the lives of his fellow beings are meaningless is not only unhappy, but barely capable of living. Cosmic religiousness. The most beautiful feeling is the mysterious side of life. It is the profound feeling that is always found in the cradle of pure art and science. He who is no longer able to feel either astonishment or surprise is, so to speak, dead. His eyes are dull. The impression of the mysterious, even if mixed with awe, has aroused, among other things, religion. To know that there is something impenetrable, to know the manifestations of the deepest intellect and the brightest beauty, which are accessible to our reason only in the most primitive forms, this knowledge and this feeling, this is true devotion. In this sense, and in this sense alone, I am among the most deeply religious of men. I cannot imagine a God who rewards and punishes the object of his creation, a God who above all exercises his will in the same way as we exercise it upon ourselves. I do not want and cannot imagine an individual who survives his bodily death. How many weak souls, out of fear and ridiculous egoism, feed on such ideas? It is enough for me to feel the mystery of the eternity of life, to have the consciousness and intuition of all that is, to struggle actively to grasp a particle, even the smallest, of the intelligence that manifests itself in nature. You will hardly find a profound spirit in scientific investigation without its characteristic religiosity. But this religiosity differs from that of the simple man. For the latter, God is a being from whom he hopes for protection and whose punishment he fears, a being with whom he has, to a certain extent, personal relations, however respectful they may be. It is an elevated feeling of the same nature as the relations between son and father. The human basis of morality. On the contrary, the sage is imbued with a sense of causality for everything that happens. For him, the future involves no less decision and no less commitment than the past. Morality has nothing divine about it. It is a purely human matter. His religiousness consists in the ecstatic admiration of the laws of nature. A mind so superior is revealed to him that all the intelligence put by men into their thoughts is in the presence of it only an absolutely null reflection. This feeling is the leitmotif of the life and efforts of the scientist, insofar as he can free himself from the tyranny of his selfish desires. Undoubtedly, this feeling is a very close relative of that which the religious creative minds of all time have experienced. Everything that is made and imagined by men serves to satisfy their needs and appease their pains. We must always keep this truth in mind for the spirit if we want to understand intellectual movements and their development, because feelings and aspirations are the engines of all human endeavor and creation, however sublime this creation may appear. What, then, are the needs and feelings that have led man to the religious idea and faith in the most extended meaning of these words? If we reflect on this question, we see at once that at the origin of religious thought and life are found the most diverse feelings. In primitive man, it is in the first place fear that arouses the religious idea. Fear of hunger, of wild beasts, of disease, of death. Since in this lower stage the ideas of causal relations are, as a rule, very limited, the human spirit imagines beings more or less analogous to us, upon whose will and action adverse and fearful events depend, and it believes that it can dispose favorably of these beings by actions and offerings, which, according to the faith handed down from time to time, must appease them and make them benign. And in this sense I call this religion the religion of terror, which, if not created, has been at least strengthened and stabilized by the formation of a particular priestly caste, which is said to be the intermediary between these feared beings and the people, and bases its dominant position on this privilege. Often the king or the head of state, who derives his authority from other factors, or even from a privileged class, unites priestly functions to his sovereignty in order to give greater firmness to the existing regime. Or a commonality of interests is determined between the caste that holds political power and the priestly caste. There is another origin of religious organization: social feelings. The father and mother leaders of the great human communities are mortal and fallible. The ardent aspiration for love, support, guidance generates the divine social and moral idea. It is the God Providence who protects, makes act, rewards, and punishes. It is that God who, according to the horizon of man, loves and encourages the life of the tribe, humanity, and life itself. That God who comforts in misfortunes and disappointed hopes, protector of the souls of the departed. Such is the idea of God considered under the moral and social aspect. In the sacred scriptures of the Jewish people, one can follow very well the evolution of religion terror into moral religion, which then continues in the New Testament. The religions of all civilized peoples, and in particular of the Eastern peoples, are essentially moral religions. The transition from religion terror to moral religion is an important step forward in the life of peoples. We must beware of the prejudice which consists in believing that the religions of primitive races are only terror religions, and those of civilized peoples only moral religions. Every religion is, after all, a mixture of the one and the other, with a greater percentage, however, of moral religion in the higher grades of social life. Ids of human form. All these religions have, however, one point in common, and that is the anthropomorphic character of the idea of God. Beyond this level, only particularly noble individualities are to be found. But in any case, there is still a third degree of religious life, though very rare in its pure expression, and it is that of cosmic religiosity. It cannot be fully understood by those who do not feel it, because there is no corresponding idea of an anthropomorphic God. The individual is aware of the vanity of human aspirations and goals, and, on the other hand, recognizes the sublime imprint and admirable order that are manifested as much in nature as in the world of thought. Individual existence gives him the impression of a prison, and he wants to live in the full knowledge of all that is, in its universal unity, and in its profound meaning. Already in the first degrees of the evolution of religion, for example, in several Psalms of David and in some prophets, we find the first indications of cosmic religion. But the elements of this religion are strongest in Buddhism, as we have learned particularly from the admirable writings of Schopenhauer. Cosmic religiosity knows no dogma. The religious geniuses of all times are affected by this cosmic religiosity, which knows neither dogmas nor gods conceived according to the image of man. Therefore, there is no church which bases its fundamental teaching upon cosmic religion. Consequently, it is precisely among the heretics of all times that we find men who have been penetrated by this higher religiosity, and who were considered by their contemporaries most often as atheists, but often also as saints. Democritus, Francis of Assisi, and Spinoza stand close together. In this respect, men like Democritus, Francis of Assisi, and Spinoza can stand next to each other. How can cosmic religiosity be communicated from man to man, if it leads neither to any formal idea of God nor to any theory? It seems to me that it is precisely the capital function of art and science to awaken and keep alive this feeling among those who have the faculty to collect it. Antagonism between religion of terror and science. We thus arrive at a conception of the relationship between science and religion, which is very different from the usual conception. According to historical considerations, one is inclined to consider science and religion irreconcilable antagonists, and this is easily understood. The man who believes in causal laws, arbiters of all events, if he takes the hypothesis of causality seriously, cannot conceive the idea of a being who intervenes in human affairs, and therefore religion terror, like social or moral religion, has no credence with him. A God who rewards and punishes is inconceivable to him, because man acts according to ineluctable external and internal laws, and consequently could not be responsible to God, in the same way that an inanimate object is not responsible for its movements. Science has been wrongly reproached with undermining morality. Man's ethical conduct must indeed be based on compassion, education, and social ties, without recourse to any religious principle. Men would be to be pitied if they were to be restrained by the fear of punishment or the hope of reward after death. We can therefore understand why the Church has at all times fought science and persecuted its followers. Wonderful agreement between cosmic religiosity and science. On the other hand, I affirm that the cosmic region is the most powerful and noblest impulse for scientific research. Only he who can appreciate the efforts, and especially the enormous sacrifices which have been made in order to arrive at those scientific discoveries which open up new paths, can realize the power of feeling which alone can arouse such a work, free from all bonds with immediate practical life. What profound joy in the sight of the building of the world, and what ardent desire to know, even if limited to a few faint rays of the splendor revealed by the admirable order of the universe, must have possessed Kepler and Newton to have been able, in a solitary work of long years, to unravel the celestial mechanism. He who knows scientific research only through its practical effects cannot possibly form an adequate opinion of the state of mind of these men who, surrounded by skeptical contemporaries, opened the way for those who, understanding their ideas, spread from century to century through all the countries of the world. Only he who has devoted his life to similar goals can form a vivid picture of what has animated these men and what has given them the strength to remain faithful to their goal, despite countless failures. It is cosmic religiosity that gives such strength. It is not without reason that a contemporary author has said that in our age, which is generally devoted to materialism, scientists are the only people who are profoundly religious. Elevate the men. It is right in principle to give solemn testimony of affection to those who have contributed most to the ennoblement of humanity and human existence. But if one also wishes to investigate the nature of them, then one encounters considerable difficulties. With regard to political leaders, and even religious leaders, it is often very difficult to determine whether they have done more good than harm. Consequently, I sincerely believe that directing people to the culture of noble disciplines and then indirectly elevating them is the best service that can be rendered to humanity. This method finds confirmation, in the first place, in the lovers of letters, of philosophy, and the arts, but also, after them, in the scientists. It is not, it is true, the results of their research which elevate and enrich people morally, but it is their effort to understand, their fruitful and capable intellectual work. A man's true worth is determined by examining to what extent and in what sense he has come to free himself from the ego. Peace. The truly superior men of past generations recognize the importance of efforts to secure international peace. But in our time, the development of technology has made this ethical postulate a matter of existence for today's civilized mankind, and active participation in the solution of the problem of peace is regarded as a matter of conscience, which no conscientious man can ignore. It must be realized that the powerful industrial groups interested in the manufacture of weapons are, in all countries, opposed to the peaceful settlement of international disputes, and that the rulers will not be able to achieve this important goal without the energetic support of the majority of the population. In this age of democratic regimes, the fate of peoples depends on the peoples themselves. This fact must be present in the minds of each and every one of them at all times. The International of Science. When the nationalist and political blindness reached its peak during the war, Emilio Fischer, the famous chemist, energetically pronounced the following words during a session at the Academy. "You can do nothing, gentlemen. Science is and remains international." And this the great among men of science have always known and felt passionately, even if in periods of political complications they remained isolated in the midst of their colleagues of small genius. The crowd that has the right to vote has, during the war and in all fields, betrayed the inviolable good that had been entrusted to it. The International Association of Academies has been dissolved. Congresses have been and still are organized with the exclusion of colleagues from former enemy countries. Certain political considerations, presented with great importance, prevent the affirmation of purely objective points of view, which is nevertheless indispensable for achieving high results. What can men of good will, those who do not abandon themselves to the temptations of passion of the moment, do to regain what has been lost? Truly, international and large-scale congresses cannot yet, because of the present disturbance, accommodate the majority of intellectual workers, and the psychological resistance to the re-establishment of international scientific associations is still too powerful to be overcome by that minority, animated by views and feelings superior to these contingencies. Those who belong to this minority can contribute to the re-establishment of the international communities by maintaining close relations with like-minded scientists in other countries and by intervening tenaciously in their own circle of action in favor of international interests. Success in a big way will be long in coming, but it will surely come. I do not want to let this occasion pass without highlighting with great pleasure the singular action of a remarkable number of English colleagues who have actively expressed, during these painful years, aspirations for the maintenance of the intellectual community. Everywhere, the official statements are worse than the opinion of the individual. These well-meaning people must not forget this, nor must they allow themselves to be irritated or misled. Senatores boni viri, senatus autem bestia. If I am full of hope and confidence as regards the general international organization, this hope, rather than on judgment and on nobility of feeling, is based on the imperious pressure of economic development. And since this derives largely from intellectual work, including that of scientists with reactionary ideas, the latter will contribute, even in spite of themselves, to the creation of the international organization. Our continent will only be able to achieve a new prosperity if the latent struggle between the traditional forms of state is brought to an end. The political organization of Europe must be resolutely directed towards the elimination of inconvenient customs barriers. This higher aim cannot be attained by conventions between states alone. The preliminary preparation of spirits is, first of all, indispensable. We must endeavor to awaken gradually among men a feeling of solidarity, which does not stop, as has happened hitherto, at the frontiers of states, a difficult mission. For it must be confessed to my great regret that at least in the countries with which I am most familiar, Scientists and artists allow themselves to be led more willingly by petty national tendencies than men of action. Scientific research. Scientific truth and no. It is not easy to define clearly the term scientific truth. Likewise, the sense of the word truth is different according to whether it refers to psychological facts, to a mathematical proposition, or to a theory of natural science. But I really cannot get a clear idea of what is meant by religious truth. Second, scientific research can diminish superstition by encouraging reasoning and causal exploration. It is certain that underlying all somewhat sensitive scientific work is the conviction, analogous to religious feeling, that the world is grounded in reason and can be understood. Third, this conviction, connected with the profound feeling of the existence of a superior mind, which manifests itself in the world of experience, constitutes for me the idea of God. In current language, it may be called pantheism, Spinoza. 4. I can only consider denominational traditions from a historical and psychological point of view. I have no other relation to them. Research fundamentals. What a variety of styles in the temple of science, and how different are the men who frequent it, and how different the moral forces that have led them there. More than one devotes himself to science with the joy of realizing his own superior intellectual faculties. For him, science is the favorite sport that allows him to live an intense life and to satisfy his ambitions. There are also many who, for utilitarian purposes only, wish to bring their offerings to the effervescence of the brain. It would be enough for a divine angel to expel from the temple the men of these two categories, and the building would remain disturbingly empty if there were not still a few men of the past and present. Of this number our Planck belongs, and this is the reason why we love him. I am well aware that in this way we would have light-heartedly expelled from the temple some men who built a large part of it, perhaps the largest. For many, the decision taken would probably have appeared bitter to the angel of heaven himself. But one thing seems to me certain. If there had been but men of that kind, the temple could not have risen, any more than a few climbing plants could, by themselves, give birth to a forest. In truth, for these men, any place in human activity is sufficient. External circumstances will decide whether they are engineers, officers, merchants, or scientists. But let us now turn our eyes to those who have found favor with the angel. Here we see individuals who are, for the most part, singular, closed, isolated, and who, in spite of these common features, resemble each other far less than those who are excluded. What impulse led them to the temple? The answer is not easy, and certainly cannot apply equally to all. I believe with Schopenhauer that the most powerful impulse that drives them towards art and science is the desire to escape from everyday life, with its painful harshness and its hopeless emptiness, to escape the chains of eternally changing individual desires. It drives the most sensitive beings out of their individual selves towards the world of contemplation and objective judgment. This impulse is comparable to the ardent desire which irresistibly draws citizens out of their burning and confusing surroundings to the placid regions of the high mountains, where the eye loses itself gently far away through the calm and purity of the atmosphere and caresses restful contours which seem created for eternity. But to this motive, so to speak negative, is added another positive one. Man seeks, in a manner suited to his needs, to form an image of the world, clear and simple, and thus to triumph over the world of existence by striving to replace it, to a certain extent, with this image so that they act, each in his own way. The painter, the poet, the speculative philosopher, the naturalist. He makes this image and its confirmation the center of gravity of his sentimental life, in order to seek in it the calm and solidity that elude him in the too narrow circle of his personal and whirling existence. Among all these possible images of the world, which is the position occupied by the one created by the theoretical physicist? This image implies the strictest demands as to the rigor and exactness of representation of reciprocal relations, such as can only be had by using mathematical language. But, on the other hand, the physicist must resign himself to this all the more categorically, as he must be content to represent the simplest phenomena, those that can be made perceptible by our senses, while all the more complex phenomena cannot be reconstructed by the human spirit with that precision and that spirit of subtle coherence invoked by the theoretical physicist. The extreme sharpness, clearness, certainty can only be obtained at the expense of entirety. But what attraction, then, can there be in grasping exactly so small a part of nature, leaving aside, timidly and without courage, all that is more complicated and more delicate? Does the result of such a resigned effort deserve this name full of pride, the image of the world? Yes. I believe that this name is deserved because the general laws, which serve as a basis for the constructions of the thought of the theoretical physicist, have the pretension of being valid for all events of rigorously logical deductions. One should arrive at a rigorously exact image, that is to say, a theory of the natural phenomena, including those of life, if this process of deduction did not far exceed the capacity of the human brain. One does not therefore give up entirely and in principle the entire physical image of the world. The highest mission of the physicist is therefore the search for these elementary laws, the most general ones, from which he starts to reach, through simple deductions, the image of the world. No logical path leads to these elementary laws. Intuition alone, founded on experience, can lead us to them. This uncertainty in the method to be followed might lead one to believe that it would be possible to establish at will a large number of systems of theoretical physics of equivalent value. Even as a principle, this opinion is certainly well-founded. But the development of the question has shown that, of all imaginable constructions, only one, for the time being, has manifested itself as absolutely superior to all the others. None of those who have really investigated the problem would be able to deny that the world of observations practically determines, without ambiguity, the theoretical system, and that nevertheless, every way of logic brings data of observation to the principles of the theory. It is what Leibniz has so happily called the pre-established harmony. It is precisely for failing to take sufficient account of this circumstance that physicists have made a harsh rebuke of many theorists of knowledge. And it is also in this that I seem to locate the origins of the controversy of a few years ago between Mach and Planck. The ardent desire for a vision of this pre-established harmony is the source of the perseverance and inexhaustible patience with which we see Planck devoting himself to the more general problems of our science without allowing himself to be diverted from more easily attainable and more utilitarian goals. I have often heard it said that some colleagues attributed this way of acting to an extraordinary energy and discipline. I think they are completely wrong. The sentimental state that makes one fit for such actions resembles that of religious people or lovers. The daily effort does not come from calculation or from a program, but from an immediate need. I see at this point our dear Planck laughing to himself at my childish use of Diogenes' lantern. Our sympathy for him need not rest on flimsy arguments. May the love for science embellish his life also in the future, and lead him to the solution of that most important problem of physics, which he himself has posed and powerfully developed. May he succeed in uniting the quantum theory with electrodynamics and mechanics in a system logically constituting a whole. Planck's quanta. Planck showed that in order to establish a law of thermal radiation in agreement with experience, it is necessary to use a method of calculation whose incompatibility with the principles of classical mechanics becomes more and more evident. Thanks to this method, Planck introduced in physics the quantum hypothesis, which was later the object of brilliant verifications. With this quantum hypothesis, he overturned classical mechanics in the case in which sufficiently small masses move with velocities that reach very small values and sufficiently large accelerations, so that today we cannot consider valid anymore the laws of the motion of Galileo and Newton, if not as limit laws. However, in spite of the most tenacious efforts of the theorists, it has not been possible up to now to come to replace the principles of the mechanics with others that correspond to the law of the thermal radiation of Planck, or to the hypothesis of the quanta. Although there is no longer any doubt that we have traced heat to a molecular movement, nevertheless we must confess that we find ourselves today before the fundamental laws of this movement in the same situation as the astronomers before Newton, before the movements of the planets. I have alluded to a set of facts in the theoretical study of which the principles fail. One may equally present the case in which clearly formulated principles lead to consequences which go wholly or almost wholly beyond the limits of the domain of facts at present accessible to our experience. It may be in this case that a work of empirical research of long years is necessary to know whether the principles correspond to the theory of reality. The theory of relativity offers us an example of this. The analysis of the fundamental ideas of time and space has shown us that the theorem of the constancy of the speed of light in vacuum, which is deduced from the optics of moving bodies, does not at all compel us to accept the general theory that takes into account the circumstance that, in the experiments carried out on the Earth, we never notice anything of the movement of Earth's translation. We make use, in this case, of the principle of relativity that says, the natural laws do not change their form when we pass from the initial system of coordinates, recognized as correct, to a new system conceived as animated by a uniform translation movement in relation to itself. This theory has already received from the experience remarkable verifications and has led, in union with the complex of the collected facts, to a simplification of the theoretical representation. But on the other hand, from the theoretical point of view, this theory does not give entire satisfaction, because the principle of relativity stated above gives preference to uniform motion. If it is true that starting from the physical point of view, one cannot attribute an absolute sense to the uniform motion, the question to know if this statement must extend equally to the non-uniform motions arises spontaneously. It has been proved that if one takes as a basis the principle of relativity extended in this sense, one obtains a very characterized extension of the theory of relativity, and is led thus to a general theory of gravitation, including dynamics. We have established that inductive physics poses questions to deductive physics and vice versa, and that the answer to these questions demands the tension of all efforts. The question of method. If you wish to learn anything from theoretical physicists about the methods they employ, I advise you to observe this principle. Do not listen to their speeches, but stick to their actions. For to him who creates, the products of his own imagination seem so necessary and natural that he does not consider, and would not wish them to be considered, as inventions of thought, but as concrete realities. These words seem to be made on purpose to induce you to abandon this subject, for you will say, "Here is a scientist who is himself an experimental physicist. He should therefore leave all reflections on the structure of theoretical science to the theorists of knowledge." Objectively speaking, in order to justify my effort, I say that it may be interesting to know what a man who has devoted his whole life to clarifying and perfecting its principles thinks of his science. The way in which he views the past and the present of the field to which he devotes himself may depend very much on what he expects from the future and what he hopes to obtain from the present. It happens to him as it happens to the historian who unites actual becoming, though perhaps unconsciously, with the ideals he has formed about human society. We want here to give a quick glance at the evolution of the theoretical system and, in this connection, to bring our first attention more especially to the relation between the theoretical background and the set of experimental facts. This is the eternal opposition between two inseparable elements of our knowledge, empiricism and reasoning. We honor ancient Greece as the cradle of Western science. There, for the first time, was created a logical system, a marvel of thought, whose statements are so clearly deduced from each other that each of the propositions demonstrated does not raise the slightest doubt. This is the geometry of Euclid. This admirable work of reason has given the human brain the greatest confidence in its further endeavors. He who in his early youth did not feel enthusiasm before this work was not born to be a theoretical scientist, but for logical thought to be ripe for a science that embraces reality, a second fundamental knowledge was needed, which until Kepler and Galileo was not the common good of philosophers. Logical thought alone cannot provide us with knowledge about the world of experience and ends in it. Purely logical propositions are empty before reality. It is thanks to this knowledge, and above all to having hammered it into the world of science, that Galileo became the father of modern physics, and above all of modern natural science. But then, if experience is the alpha and omega of all our knowledge about reality, what is the place of reason in science? A complete system of theoretical physics is composed of ideas, of fundamental laws which must be applicable to these ideas, and of consequent propositions which are derived from them by logical deduction. It is these propositions which must correspond to our individual experiences. Their logical deduction necessarily occupies, in a work of theory, nearly all the pages, and after all exactly the same in the geometry of Euclid, except that in this the fundamental principles are called axioms, and the question is not raised that the consequent propositions must correspond to any experience. But if one conceives Euclidean geometry as the doctrine of the possibilities of the reciprocal position of practically rigid bodies, and if, consequently, one interprets it as a physical science without making abstraction from its initial empirical background, the logical identity of geometry and theoretical physics is complete. We have therefore assigned to reason and experience their place in the system of a theoretical physics. Reason gives the structure of the system. The content of the experiences and their reciprocal relations must, thanks to the consequent propositions of the theory, find their representation. In the possibility of such a representation lies solely the value and justification of the whole system, and in particular of the concepts and principles which form its basis. On the other hand, these concepts and principles are free creations of the human spirit, which cannot be justified a priori either by the nature of the human spirit or in any other way. The fundamental ideas and principles, which cannot logically be made more elementary, constitute the inevitable, rationally elusive part of the theory. The capital aim of any theory is to make these irreducible fundamental elements as simple and as numerous as possible, without being obliged to give up the adequate representation of any experimental theme. The conception which I have sketched of the purely fictitious character of the principles of theory was not at all in vogue in the 18th and 19th centuries, but it gains ground day by day, so that the distance between the fundamental laws and concepts on the one hand and the consequences to be related to our experiences on the other hand increases more and more as the logical construction becomes more and more unified. That is to say, the whole edifice can be rested on a smaller number of conceptual elements logically independent of each other. Newton, the first creator of an extensive and mighty system of theoretical physics, still believed in this respect that the fundamental ideas and laws of his system were derived from experience. It is probable that his hypotheses non fingo must be interpreted in this sense. In fact, at this time, nothing problematic appeared in the ideas of space and time. The concepts of mass, inertia, force, and their interdependent relations seemed to be directly based on experience. Once this basis was admitted, the expression of the force of gravitation derived, in fact, from experience, and the same could be said for the other forces. We observe, however, that the idea of absolute space, which implies that of absolute rest, was for Newton a source of disquiet. He was, in fact, convinced that nothing in experience seemed to correspond to the latter concept. He was also concerned about the introduction of actions at a distance. But the prodigious practical success of his doctrine may have prevented him and the physicists of the 18th and 19th centuries from realizing the fictitious character of the principles of his system. On the contrary, most of the scientists of this age who studied nature were imbued with the idea that the concepts and the fundamental laws of physics are not, from the point of view of logic, creations of the human spirit, but that it was possible to deduce them from experience by abstraction, that is to say, by a logical way. To tell the truth, it is only the theory of generalized relativity that has allowed to recognize clearly the falsity of this conception. In fact, this theory has shown that it was possible, with foundations very distant from those of Newton, to agree, in a more satisfactory and more complete way than the Newtonian principles allowed, with all the correlative facts in the field of the experience. But leaving aside the question of superiority, the fictitious character of the principles became entirely apparent, so that two essentially different principles could be presented which agree to a large extent with experience. This proves, however, that every attempt to deduce logically from elementary experience the fundamental ideas and laws of mechanics is doomed to failure. But if it is true that the axiomatic foundation of theoretical physics does not descend from experience, and must on the contrary be freely created, is there any hope of finding the right way? Or more strongly, does this right way exist only in our imagination? And above all, can we hope to find in experience a sure guide if there are theories, such as classical mechanics, which largely give reason to experience without grasping the bottom of the matter? To this I confidently reply that, in my opinion, the right way exists and that we can find it. According to our experience so far, We have a right to be convinced that nature is the realization of everything that can be imagined to be most mathematically simple. I am convinced that the purely mathematical construction allows us to discover these concepts that give us the key to understanding natural phenomena and the principles that bind them together. The usable mathematical concepts can be suggested by experience, but never be deduced from it under any circumstances. Experience, of course, remains the only criterion for using a mathematical construction for physics. But it is in mathematics that the truly creative principle is found. From a certain point of view, I recognize that pure thought is capable of grasping reality, as the ancients thought. To justify this confidence, I am forced to use mathematical concepts. The physical world is represented by a four-dimensional continuum. If I take in it a Riemann metric and search for the simplest laws to which this metric obeys, I arrive at the relativistic theory of gravitation of empty space. If in this space I take a field of vectors or the antisymmetric field derived from it, and look for the simplest laws to which this field can obey, I arrive at Maxwell's equations of empty space. At this point, we are still missing a theory concerning the zones of space in which the electric density does not disappear. De Broglie had the intuition of the existence of a wave field that served to explain certain quantum properties of matter. Dirac has found with his spinors some new values of the field, from which with very simple equations it is possible to deduce to a large extent the properties of electrons. Now I have found with my collaborator that these spinors constitute a particular case of a kind of field of a new type, mathematically related to the four-dimensional system, which we have called semivectors. The simplest equations to which these half-vectors can be subjected allow us to understand the existence of two elementary particles of different ponderable masses and of equal weight, but of opposite signs. After the known vectors, these semivectors are the simplest possible mathematical elements of the field in a four-dimensional metric continuum, and it seems that they can characterize, in a natural way, the characteristic properties of elementary electric particles. To deal with this question, it is essential that all these structures and their connection with the fundamental laws can be obtained on the principle of the search for the simplest mathematical concepts and their connection. It is on the delimitation of the simple species of mathematically existing fields and of the simple equations which it is possible to establish between them that the theorist bases his hope of grasping the real in all its depth. The most difficult point of a field theory of this nature resides for the moment in the understanding of the atomic structure of matter and energy. The theory in its principles is not, in truth, atomic as long as it operates with continuous functions of space, contrarily to what happens in the classic mechanics, whose most important element, the material point, already gives reason to the atomic structure of the matter. The modern quantum theory, in its form characterized by the names of de Broglie, Schrödinger, Dirac, the one that operates with continuous functions, has triumphed over this difficulty thanks to a daring interpretation that Max Born first clearly expressed. The space functions that intervene in the atomic equations do not pretend to be a mathematical model of atomic formations. They must only determine by calculation the probabilities that there are of finding formations of this kind in the case of a measurement over a given area or in a given state of motion. Logically, this conception is irrecusable and has had important results. Unfortunately, it obliges us to use a continuum whose number of dimensions is not that of space as physicists have considered it up to now, i.e., 4, but grows in an unlimited way with the number of molecules constituting the system considered. I can't help confessing that I don't agree to this interpretation only a provisional meaning. I still believe in the possibility of a model of reality, that is, of a theory which presents the things themselves and not only the probability of their appearance. On the other hand, it seems to me certain that we must, in a theoretical model, abandon the idea of a complete localization of the molecules. This, if I am not mistaken, is what remains of the result of Heisenberg's uncertainty relation. One can very well conceive of an atomic theoretic in the proper sense, and not according to a simple interpretation, without localization of molecules in a mathematical model. For example, to agree with the atomic character of electricity, it suffices that the field equations lead to this consequence. A portion of space, in 3 dimensions, at the limit of which the electric density disappears everywhere, always contains a total electric charge of integer value. In a theory of the continuum, the atomic character of the expressions of integrals could, consequently, be satisfactorily expressed without localization of formations constituting the atomic structure. Only if we had succeeded in establishing such a representation of the atomic structure would I consider the quantum problem as solved. Evolution of physics, Kepler and Newton. Copernicus had drawn the attention of the most select minds to the fact that one could have a clear notion of the apparent motion of the planets by considering these motions as revolutions around the supposedly immobile sun. If the motion of a planet was a uniform circular motion about the sun as its center, it would have been relatively easy to determine what those motions must look like as seen from the Earth. But as it manifested itself in much more complex phenomena, the work was much more difficult. It was necessary first to determine these movements empirically according to Tycho Brahe's observations of the planets. Only later could one think of finding the general laws to which these movements obey. To understand how difficult the task of determining the real movement of rotation was, we must understand the following. We can never see where a planet really is at any given moment. We can only see in what direction it is seen by the Earth, which itself describes a curve of an unknown nature around the Sun. The difficulties, therefore, seemed insurmountable. Kepler found a means of bringing order to this chaos. First, he recognized the need to determine the motion of the Earth. This would have been simply impossible if there were only the Sun, the Earth, and the stars, fixed without any other planet. In this case, nothing else could be determined but the variation in the course of the year of the straight line Earth-Sun, apparent movement of the Sun in relation to the fixed stars. It was thus possible to know that all these directions were in a fixed plane in relation to the fixed stars, at least as far as the imprecise observations made at the time without a telescope allowed. It was also necessary to determine in the same way how the Earth-Sun line rotates around the Sun, and it was found that the angular velocity of this movement changes regularly in the course of the year. But this could not yet be of much help, since the annual variation of the Earth-Sun distance was not known. Only when the annual changes in this distance were known would it be possible to trace the correct trajectory of the Earth and determine its law. Kepler found an admirable way out of this dilemma. First of all, it appeared from solar observations that the velocity of the apparent path of the Sun against the background of the fixed stars was different in the various epochs of the year, but that the angular velocity of this motion was always the same in the same epoch of the astronomical year, and consequently the velocity of rotation of the Earth-Sun line, examined in relation to the same region of the fixed stars, always had the same value. It was therefore possible to admit that the orbit of the Earth closed on itself, and that the Earth went through it every year in the same way, a fact not at all evident a priori. Copernicus's followers were therefore almost certain that this procedure could also be applied to the orbits of the other planets. This was already an improvement. But how to determine the true form of the Earth's orbit? Let us admit, somewhere in the plane of this orbit, the presence of a powerful lantern M. We know that this lantern is fixed, and that it therefore constitutes for the determination of the Earth's orbit a kind of fixed point of triangulation on which the inhabitants of the Earth can point at any time of the year. Let us further admit that this lantern is at a greater distance from the Sun than from the Earth. This is how, with the help of this lantern, the orbit of the Earth can be determined. First of all, there is every year a moment in which the Earth T is exactly on the line joining the Sun, S, to the lantern M. If at this moment we point from the Earth to the lantern, the direction thus obtained is also the direction SM, Sun lantern. Let us admit that this direction is traced in the sky. Let us now take another position of the Earth at another time. Since the Sun and the lantern can be observed equally well from the Earth, the angle in T of the triangle STM is known. On the other hand, a direct observation of the Sun gives the direction ST, and previously the direction SM was determined once and for all against the background of the fixed stars. The angle in S is also known. Choosing at will a base SM, one can therefore draw on the map the triangle STM. One does this construction several times during the year, and one will obtain each time on the map a point for the Earth T in relation to the base SM, defined once for all, corresponding to a fixed date. The orbit of the Earth would thus be empirically determined, except of course for its absolute size. But you will say, where did Kepler get the M lantern? His genius, aided in this case by benign nature, made him find it. There was, for example, the planet Mars, of which the annual revolution was known. That is, the time it takes this planet to make one revolution around the Sun. It may happen that the Sun, the Earth, and Mars at a given time are exactly in a straight line, and this position of Mars repeats itself every time at the end of 1, 2, etc. Martian years, because Mars runs a closed trajectory. At this given time, SM always presents the same base, while the Earth is always at a different point of its orbit. The observations of Mars and the Sun, at the dates in question, consequently provide a means of determining the true orbit of the Earth, the planet Mars having at those times the part of the fictitious lantern just now. It was at this time that Kepler found the true form of the Earth's orbit and the laws which govern it. We others who came later must honor and admire him for this. Once the Earth's orbit had been empirically determined, the line ST was known at all times in its true magnitude and direction. Then it was no longer difficult for Kepler in principle to calculate, according to observations of the planets, their orbits and movements, an immense task given the development of mathematics at that time. There now remained the second part, no less difficult than the work that filled Kepler's life. The orbits were known empirically, but, from these empirical results, laws had to be derived. It was first necessary to establish a hypothesis as to the mathematical nature of the curve, and to verify it by enormous calculations, the data of which were already known. If the result did not agree, to make another hypothesis and verify it again. After researches whose immensity can be guessed, Kepler found a concordant result. The orbit is an ellipse of which the Sun occupies one of the foci. He also found the law of variation of velocity on the orbit, according to which the planet-sun line travels over equal surfaces in equal times. Finally, Kepler also found that the squares of the times of revolution are proportional to the third powers of the great axes of the ellipse. In troubled and distressed times such as ours, when it is difficult to find joy in men and in the course of human events, it is particularly consoling to evoke the memory of so great, so serene a man as Kepler. He lived at a time when the existence of general laws for natural phenomena was by no means established with certainty. How great must have been his faith in these laws to give him the strength to devote dozens of years of patient and difficult work, in isolation without any support, little understood by his contemporaries, to the empirical search for the motion of the planets and the mathematical laws of this motion. To the admiration for this sublime man must be added another feeling of admiration and veneration that goes no longer to a human being, but to the mysterious harmony of nature into which we are born. Since ancient times, men have imagined curves responding to laws as simple as possible. Among them, next to the straight line and the circle, the ellipse and the hyperbola. Now we see these forms realized in the trajectories described by celestial bodies, at least with great approximation. It appears that human nature is required to construct forms independently before it can prove the existence of nature. It stands out marvelously well from the admirable works to which Kepler devoted his life, that knowledge cannot be derived from experience alone, but that a comparison between what the human spirit has conceived and what it has observed is necessary. Doubtless, the great materialists of Greek antiquity had established that all facts concerning matter should refer to a succession of atoms strictly regulated by laws without any intervention of the will of the living as an independent cause. Descartes had taken up this postulate in his own way, but it remained in the state of an audacious desire, of a problematic ideal of a philosophical school. There was, before Newton, no factual result which could have rested on the confidence of perfect physical causality. As no one else ever did before or after him, Newton pointed the way to the thought, study, and practical training of the West. He is not only the ingenious creator of particular methods of direction, he has also singularly mastered the empirical elements known in his time, and his spirit has appeared wonderfully ingenious in mathematical and physical argumentation. For all these reasons he is worthy of our high veneration. But this noble figure is of even greater importance than that due to his authority as a teacher, because fate has placed him at a turning point in the development of the human spirit. To realize this exactly, we must not forget that, before Newton, there was no well-defined system of physical causation capable of grasping the deepest features of the world of experience. The aim pursued by Newton was to answer the following question: is there a simple rule by which the motion of the celestial bodies of our planetary system can be fully calculated, if the state of motion of all these bodies at a given time is known? We were in the presence of Kepler's empirical laws of planetary motion, taken from the observations of Tycho Brahe, and which demanded an explanation. Certainly, these laws fully explained the motion of the planets around the Sun, elliptical shape of the orbit, equality of the areas described in equal times, relation between the great semi-axes and the duration of the path. But these rules do not satisfy the necessary condition of causality. They are three rules, logically independent of each other, which allow us to observe the lack of any internal correlation. The third law cannot be applied with immediacy, numerically, to any other central body than the Sun. For example, there is no relation between the duration of the path around the sun and that of a satellite around the planet. But the most important point is this: these laws refer to the motion taken as a whole, and not to the way in which the state of motion of a system in a given moment derives from the state of motion that immediately preceded it. In our modern language, we will say that they are integral laws and not differential laws. The differential law is the only form which fully satisfies the necessary condition of causality of the modern physicist. To have had the definite conception of the differential law is one of the greatest merits of Newton's genius. To arrive at this, it was not only necessary to have the intervention of thought, but it was also necessary to have a mathematical method of formulae, which existed, it is true, in the rudiments, but which had to receive a systematic form. Newton discovered likewise this form in the differential and integral calculus. One can here leave out the question whether Leibniz arrived at these same mathematical procedures independently of Newton or not. But in any case, one can say that they were for Newton a necessity, because they alone could give to his thought a means of expression. Galileo had already made an important step on the way to the discovery of the law of motion. It was he who found the law of inertia and the law of free fall of bodies in the field of gravitation of the earth. A mass, more exactly a material point, not influenced by other masses, moves in a straight line and with uniform motion. In the field of gravity, the vertical velocity of a free body increases proportionally to time. Today it may seem that little progress has been made from Galileo's discoveries to Newton's law of motion. We must, however, point out that the two-sided propositions concern, according to their form, the motion of a whole, while Newton's law of motion gives an answer to the following question: how does the state of motion of a material point manifest itself in an infinitely small time under the influence of an external force? Only by passing to the observation of the phenomenon in an infinitely small time, differential law, Newton arrived to establish formulas applicable to any motion. He drew the idea of force from statics, which was already well developed. He could only establish the link between force and acceleration by introducing the new concept of mass, which, it can be said, is curiously supported by a definition that is not such if only in appearance. Today we are so accustomed to the formation of ideas corresponding to differential quotients that we can no longer evaluate what powerful capacity of abstraction has been necessary to reach, through a double derivation, the general differential law of motion when the concept of mass was still to be invented. But this was by no means sufficient to obtain a causal law of the phenomena of motion. Because the equation of motion only determined motion when the force was known. Newton had well had the idea, probably considering the laws of motion of the planets, that the force acting on a mass is determined by the position of all the masses, which are at a sufficiently small distance from the mass in question. Only when this relation was known, a complete causal conception of the phenomena of motion was had. Everybody knows how Newton, starting from Kepler's laws of planetary motion, solved the problem with gravitation, and thus discovered the identity between the driving forces acting on the stars and gravity. It is only the association between the law of motion and the law of attraction that constitutes this admirable edifice of thought, which makes it possible to calculate, starting from the state of a system existing at a given instant, the anterior and posterior states, so long as the phenomena take place solely through the effect of the forces of gravitation. What makes the Newtonian system logical and harmonious is that all the causes of the acceleration of the masses of a system act only on these masses themselves. On this basis, Newton came to explain the motions of the planets, satellites, comets down to the minutest details, as well as the ebb and flow, the precessional motion of the Earth. A work of deduction of a unique magnitude. An admirable effect was also had by the observation that the cause of the motions of the celestial bodies is identical with gravity, this so familiar phenomenon of which we have daily experience. The importance of Newton's work lies not only in the fact of having created a usable and logically satisfactory basis for mechanics properly so called, but it represented until the end of the 19th century the program of all the scientists who dedicated themselves to the research of theoretical physics. All the phenomena of physical order had to be referred to the masses that obey to Newton's law of motion. The law of forces, however, had to be developed and adapted to the nature of the facts. In this sense, Newton himself conducted his researches in the field of optics, when he supposed that light was composed of inert corpuscles. Even the theory of undulatory optics made use of Newton's law of motion, after this had been applied to continuously distributed masses. It is solely on Newton's equations of motion that the kinetic theory of heat has rested, which has not only prepared minds to know the law of conservation of energy, but has also furnished a theory of gases verified in its minutest details, as well as a thorough conception of the nature of the second principle of thermodynamics. The theory of electricity and magnetism has equally developed in modern times under the guidance of the fundamental Newtonian ideas, electric and magnetic substance, forces acting at a distance. And even the radical change brought by Faraday and Maxwell to electrodynamics and optics, which represents, after Newton, the first great advance in the foundations of theoretical physics, has still been carried out, totally, under the guidance of Newton's ideas. Maxwell, Boltzmann, Lord Kelvin, did not tire of tracing electromagnetic fields and their reciprocal dynamic actions to mechanical phenomena of hypothetical uniformly distributed masses. Only after the end of the 19th century did theoretical physics emerge from the Newtonian framework, which for almost 2 centuries had served as an intellectual guide to science and had provided it with considerable support. Newton's fundamental principles were so satisfactory from the point of view of logic that experimental facts were needed to give the impetus for new impulses. Before dealing with this subject, I must point out that Newton himself knew the weak sides of his construction better than the scientists who followed him. This circumstance has always filled me with admiration and veneration, and it is for this reason that I would like to dwell a little on the matter. Although Newton's efforts to present his system as necessarily conditioned by experience, and to introduce into it as few concepts as possible which could not refer to the direct data of experience, are acknowledged, yet he formulated the principle of space and time. He has often been reproached for this these days. But on this very point, Newton is particularly consistent with himself. He had recognized that the observable geometrical quantities, distances of material points between them, and their run in time do not characterize completely the movements from the physical point of view. He demonstrated this deduction with the famous experience of the bucket. Consequently, apart from masses and their time-varying distances, there is still something that is decisive for events. He conceives this something in relation to absolute space. He also recognizes, if his laws of motion make any sense, that space must have a kind of physical reality, a reality of the same nature as material points and their distances. This precise knowledge equally proves Newton's wisdom and the existence of a weak side of his theory, for the logical setting of it would certainly be more satisfactory without this vague concept. In this case, only elements whose relation to perceptions is quite evident would be found in the law. 2. The introduction of direct forces, acting instantaneously at a distance, to represent the effects of gravitation, do not correspond to the character of the majority of the phenomena known to us through everyday experience. To this objection, Newton answers by pointing out that his law of reciprocal action is not intended to be a definite explanation, but a rule induced by experience. 3. Newton's theory gave no explanation of the extremely remarkable fact that weight and inertia of a body are determined by the same magnitude, mass. The singularity of this fact did not escape Newton at all. None of these 3 points constitutes a logical objection against the theory. They are, to a certain extent, unsatisfied desires of the scientific spirit, struggling to penetrate totally and with a unitary concept the facts of nature. Newton's theory of motion, taken as the foundation of all theoretical physics, received its first blow from Maxwell's theory of electricity. It was found that the reciprocal actions exerted between bodies by electric and magnetic bodies are not determined by forces acting instantaneously at a distance, but by phenomena which are transferred in space at a determinate velocity. To the material point and its movement according to Faraday's conception, a physical element was added, namely the field. First, an attempt was made to formulate this new concept, based on mechanical conceptions, as a mechanical state, of motion or repression, of a hypothetical medium, the ether, that would fill space. But since, in spite of persevering efforts, this mechanical interpretation did not reach its intended goals, we got used, little by little, to conceive the electromagnetic field as the last irreducible keystone of physical reality. We are indebted to H. Hertz for having knowledgeably freed the idea of field from every accessory drawn from the background of the concepts of mechanics, to H. A. Lawrence for having freed it of the material support. According to this last idea, the only support of the field remained the empty space of physics, or ether, which, in Newton's mechanics, had not been stripped of any physical function. Once accomplished this evolution, nobody believed any more in the instantaneous direct forces acting at distance, not even in the field of the gravitation. The development of the electromagnetic field theory made it possible, after the abandonment of Newton's forces at a distance, to try to explain with electromagnetism the Newtonian law of motion, or to replace it with a more exact law based on the field theory. But if these attempts were not completely successful, the fundamental ideas of mechanics ceased to be considered as the fundamental stone in the construction of the image of the physical world. The Lorentz-Maxwell theory necessarily leads to the theory of special relativity, which, in order to eliminate the idea of absolute simultaneity, excludes the existence of forces acting at a distance. According to this theory, mass is not an immutable quantity, but depends on the energy content, and it, too, is equivalent. It showed that Newton's law of motion should be conceived as a limit law applicable to small speeds, and replaced it with a new law of motion, in which the speed of light in vacuum intervenes as a limit speed. Finally, the last step in the evolution of the field theory was reached by the theory of generalized relativity. Quantitatively, it modifies Newton's theory only very slightly, but qualitatively, it brings much more profound changes. Inertia, gravitation, and metric behavior of bodies and clocks have been brought back to a unitary quality of the field. This field was given as dependent on the bodies. Generalization of Newton's law of gravitation or of the law of the field corresponding to it, as Poisson had formulated it. With this, space and time were emptied not of their reality, but rather of their character of causal absolute, influencing the absolute but not influenced by it, that Newton had had to attribute to them in order to enunciate the laws then known. The generalized law of inertia has the function of Newton's law of motion. This brief explanation suffices to show how the elements of Newton's theory have passed into the theory of generalized relativity, thanks to which the three defective points mentioned above have disappeared. It seems that, in the framework of this last theory, the law of motion can be derived from the law of the field corresponding to Newton's law of forces. Once this has been achieved, it will be possible to speak of a pure field theory. Newton's mechanics finally opened the way to the field theory in a more formal sense. The application of Newton's mechanics to uniformly distributed masses led of necessity to the discovery and use of equations with partial derivatives, thanks to which the field theory could find an adequate expression. From this formal point of view, Newton's conception of the differential law is the first decisive step to the following development. The evolution of our ideas about natural facts, which we have treated so far, may be conceived as an organic refinement of Newton's thought. While the setting up of the field theory was reaching its fullness, some facts of thermal irradiation, of spectra, of radioactivity, etc., revealed a limit of use of the whole theory limit which, even now, would seem to us almost unattainable, in spite of the gigantic results obtained in details. Not without weighty arguments, many physicists have declared that with regard to these facts, not only the differential law has failed, but the law of causality itself, until now the last basic postulate of all natural science. The possibility of a construction of space-time which could univocally fit the physical laws has also been denied. From a field theory operating by means of differential equations, it would not seem at first sight plausible to deduce that a mechanical system, as experience confirms, is permanently capable only of discrete energy or state values. Undoubtedly, the method of de Broglie and Schrödinger, which, in a certain sense, has the character of a theory from the field, leads to the deduction, basing itself on the differential equations, of the existence of discrete states, which agrees in a surprising way with the facts of experience. But this method must renounce a localization of material particles and rigorously causal laws. Who would now dare to solve the problem of knowing whether the causal law and the differential law, these last first fruits of Newtonian theory, should be definitely abandoned? Evolution of the concept of physical reality. Belief in an external world independent of the individual who explores it is the basis of all natural science. Since, however, the perceptions of the senses give only indirect clues to this external world, to this physical real, the latter can only be grasped by us speculatively. It follows that our conceptions of the physical real can never be definitive. If we wish to agree, according to a logic as perfect as possible, with the perceptible facts, we must always be ready to modify these conceptions, otherwise called the axiomatic foundation of physics. In fact, a glance at the evolution of physics allows us to see that this foundation has undergone, in the course of time, profound changes. The most important modification of the axiomatic foundation of physics, or of our conception of the real structure, after the advent of theoretical physics by Newton, has been brought by the researches of Faraday and Maxwell on the electromagnetic phenomena. We shall now attempt to expound these concepts with more exactness by examining the evolution anterior and posterior to these researches. According to Newton's system, The physical reality is characterized by the concepts of space, time, material point, force, equivalent to the reciprocal action between material points. Physical phenomena must be understood, according to Newton, as movements of material points in space, movements governed by laws. The material point is the only representative of reality, although the latter is variable. Perceptible bodies have manifestly given rise to the idea of the material point. The material point has been imagined as the analog of mobile bodies deprived of the characters of form, extension, orientation in space, of all intrinsic properties. In short, except inertia and translation, and introducing the idea of force. These material bodies, which psychologically provoked the formation of the concept material point, had therefore in turn to be considered systems of material points. Note that this theoretical system is, in its essence, an atomic and mechanical system. Every fact had to be conceived as purely mechanical, i.e., simple motion of material points subject to Newton's law of motion. The least satisfactory point of this theoretical system, apart from the difficulty again discussed in recent times of absolute space, was to be found above all in the theory of light, which Newton, consequent with himself, conceived to be equally constituted of material points. But already at this time the following question burned the lips. What happens to the material points constituting light when it is absorbed? Not to mention that it is very difficult for the mind to consider material points of such different natures as those which must be admitted to represent ponderable substances on either side. To this were later added electric corpuscles as a third species of material points, with fundamentally different properties. Finally, the basis still presented a weak point. It is necessary to admit in a completely hypothetical and arbitrary way the forces of reciprocal action determining the becoming. Nevertheless, this conception of the real was strongly fruitful. How could it happen that it was thought to abandon it? In order to give a mathematical form to his system, Newton had necessarily to resort to the idea of derivatives and to establish the laws of motion in the form of total differential equations. This is perhaps the greatest step forward that ever was allowed to be taken by a man in the domain of thought. Partial differential equations were not necessary, and Newton made no methodical use of them. But the partial differential equations were indispensable in formulating the mechanics of deformable bodies. This is due to the fact that in these problems, the conception of such bodies as formed of material points had at first no function. But if the partial differential equation appeared as a servant in theoretical physics, it gradually took a dominant place there. This began in the 19th century when, under the pressure of observed facts, the undulatory theory of light imposed it. Light in empty space was conceived as a phenomenon of vibration of the ether, and it necessarily seemed idle to regard the latter as a conglomerate of material points. Here, for the first time, the partial differential equation was considered as the natural expression of the elementary phenomena of physics. It was thus that the continuous field intervened in a particular field of theoretical physics, close to the material point to represent the physical real. This dualism has not disappeared to this day, however embarrassing it may seem to any systematic mind. But if the idea of physical reality had ceased to be purely atomic, it continued at first to be purely mechanical. An attempt was always made to interpret every fact as a movement of inert masses, and no other way of conceiving it could even be imagined. It was then that the great upheaval took place, to which the names of Faraday, Maxwell, and Hertz will remain forever linked. But it was Maxwell who had the lion's share in this revolution. He showed that what was then known about light and electromagnetic phenomena is represented by his well-known double system of partial differential equations, in which the electric field and the magnetic field intervene as dependent variables. Maxwell actually tried to give a basis to these equations, or to justify them by means of the ideas of mechanics. But he made use of several constructions of the kind and did not take any of them really seriously, so that his own differential equations appeared as the essential, and the forces of the field that appear in them as elementary entities not susceptible to be referred to anything else. At the end of the century, the conception of the electromagnetic field as an irreducible entity had already universally imposed itself, and the most serious theories did not give credit to the justification or the possibility of a Maxwell. On the other hand, efforts were also made to spy mechanical foundations for the equations of races with the field theory and with the help of Maxwell's theory, material points, and their inertia. But these efforts were not, in the end, successful. If, neglecting the particular important results that Maxwell's work has obtained in the principal domains of physics, we bring more especially the attention on the changes that they have made undergo to the conception of the nature of the physical reality, here is what we can say. Before Maxwell, we imagined the physical reality, as representing the phenomena of nature, as material points whose modifications consist only in movements, regulated by partial differential equations. After Maxwell, physical reality was conceived as represented by continuous fields, not mechanically explainable, regulated by partial differential equations. This change in the conception of reality is the deepest and most fruitful change that physics has undergone since Newton. But it must also be confessed that for the time being, it has not been reached at all the definitive realization of the phased program. The physical systems subsequently established, which have been crowned with success, constitute rather compromises between the two programs, and just for their character of compromise, they carry the mark of the provisional and of the logically imperfect, although each of them has realized great progresses. We must first mention Lorenz's electron theory, in which the field and the electric corpuscles intervene jointly as elements of equal value in the conception of reality. Then came the theory of restricted and generalized relativity, which, although founded entirely on considerations of field theory, could not so far avoid the independent intervention of material points and total differential equations. The last creation, extremely fertile, of the theoretical physics, the mechanics of the quanta, absolutely departs, in its principle, from the two programs to which, for simplicity, we will give the name of program of Newton and program of Maxwell. In fact, the quantities that appear in the laws of the new theory do not pretend to represent the physical reality itself, but only the probabilities of intervention of the physical reality considered. Dirac, to whom we owe, in my opinion, the most perfect presentation, from the point of view of logic of this theory, warns with reason that it would not be easy to describe theoretically, for example, a photon, so that this description is conclusive and allows to say whether the photon will pass or not through a polarizer placed transversely on its path. Nevertheless, I am inclined to think that the physicists will not be satisfied for a long time with such an indirect description of the reality, even if it should be reached to conciliate in satisfactory way the theory with the postulate of the generalized relativity. In this case, it will be necessary well to try to realize again this program that it is right to call Maxwell's program. The description of the physical reality by means of fields that satisfy the partial differential equations free from singularities. Characters of the theory of relativity. In considering the specific nature of the theory of relativity, I would like to emphasize that this theory is not of speculative origin, but that its discovery is due completely and solely to the desire to adapt, as best as possible, the physical theory to the observed facts. This is not a revolutionary act, but the natural evolution of a line followed for centuries. It is not light-heartedly that certain ideas, hitherto considered as fundamental about space, time, and motion, have been abandoned, which has been imposed solely by the observation of certain facts. The law of the constancy of the speed of light in empty space, reinforced by developments in electrodynamics and optics, together with the equal rights of all systems of inertia, principle of special relativity, so clearly highlighted by Michelson, led immediately to the idea that the concept of time had to be relative, because each system of inertia had to have its own particular time. The progress of this idea then made it clear that the reciprocal relationship between actions occurring at the instant on the one hand and coordinates and time on the other had not been sufficiently considered before. In fact, one of the essential features of the theory of relativity is the effort to elaborate with greater exactness the relations between general concepts and the facts of experience. It has maintained the principle that the justification of a physical concept is based exclusively on its clear and unambiguous relation to these facts. According to the theory of restricted relativity, the coordinates of space and of time still have an absolute character in the dimensions in which they are directly measurable with rigid bodies and clocks, but they are relative insofar as they depend on the state of motion of the chosen system of inertia. The four-dimensional continuum constituted by the reunion of space and time has, according to the theory of special relativity, the same absolute character that space and time had, according to the previous theory, each separately, Minkowski. From the interpretation of coordinates and time as the result of measurements, we arrive then at the influence of movement, relative to the coordinate system, on the shape of bodies and on the course of clocks, as well as at the equivalence of energy and inert mass. The theory of generalized relativity owes its creation, in the first place, to the numerical equality, ascertained by experience, of the inert mass and the heavy mass of bodies, a fundamental fact to which classical mechanics had not given any interpretation. We arrive at this interpretation by extending the principle of relativity to coordinate systems having a relative acceleration with respect to each other. The introduction of coordinate systems with a negative acceleration in relation to the systems of inertia necessarily leads to the appearance of gravitation fields relative to the latter. It results consequently that the theory of general relativity based on the equality of inertia and weight gives origin to a theory of the field of gravitation. The introduction of coordinate systems animated by an accelerated motion with respect to each other as equivalent coordinate systems, as the identity of inertia and weight seems to make necessary, leads, in conjunction with the results of the theory of special relativity, to the following consequence. The spatial laws of solid bodies, in the presence of gravitational fields, do not respond to the rules of Euclid's geometry. An analogous result is reached with respect to the motion of clocks. From this results the necessity of a new generalization of the theory of space and time, because now the direct interpretation of coordinates of space and time with results of measurements effected by means of meters and clocks does not hold anymore. This generalization of the metric, which, thanks to the work of Gauss and Riemann, already existed in a purely mathematical field, is based essentially on the fact that the metric of the theory of special relativity for small fields can still claim to be valid in the general case. The evolution we have exposed removes from the space-time coordinates any independent reality. The metric reality is now given only by the union of these coordinates with the values that delimit the field of gravitation. The evolution in the world of thought of the theory of generalized relativity has another origin. As Ernst Mach has already pointed out, there is, in Newton's theory, the following point which does not satisfy. If one considers motion not from the causal point of view, but from the purely descriptive point of view, there is no other motion than the relative motion of things in relation to each other. But the acceleration that appears in Newton's equations of motion is not conceivable starting from the idea of relative motion. It forced Newton to imagine a physical space in relation to which an acceleration should exist. This idea of an absolute space introduced ad hoc is, to tell the truth, logically correct, but it does not seem satisfactory. It has been tried subsequently to modify the equations of the mechanics in such way that the inertia of the bodies is brought back to a relative movement not in relationship to the absolute space, but in relationship to the totality of the other ponderable bodies. Given the state of knowledge at that time, his attempt had to fail. To have posed this problem appears entirely rational. This evolution of thought imposed itself in front of the theory of general relativity, with a powerfully strengthened intensity, because according to this theory, the physical properties of space are influenced by ponderable matter. I am convinced that the theory of general relativity cannot solve this problem that considering the world as a closed space. The mathematical results of the theory lead obligatorily to this conception if it is admitted that the average density of the ponderable matter in the world possesses a finite value, however small. What is the theory of relativity? In physics, one can distinguish theories of different nature. Most of them are constructive theories. By means of a relatively simple system of formulas located at the base, they try to build a picture of relatively complex phenomena. It is in this way that the kinetic theory of gases tries to lead back the mechanical, thermal, and diffusion phenomena to movements of molecules, that is to say, to construct from the hypothesis of molecular motion. When we say that we have succeeded in understanding a group of natural phenomena, it always means that we have found a constructive theory that embraces the phenomena in question. But besides this important class of theories, there is a second which, instead of the synthetic method, employs the analytic method. Here the starting point and the basis are not constituted by elements of hypothetical construction, but by general properties of natural phenomena empirically determined from which derive subsequently mathematically formulated criteria to which particular phenomena or their theoretical images must satisfy. It is so that thermodynamics, starting from the general result of the experience according to which the perpetual motion is impossible, tries to determine, by analytic way, the relations to which the particular phenomena must conform. The theory of relativity belongs to the second category. In order to understand its essence, we must therefore learn first of all the principles on which it is based. But before examining them, I must point out that the theory of relativity resembles a building with two floors, which are the theory of restricted relativity and the theory of generalized relativity. The former, which is the foundation of the latter, concerns all physical phenomena, with the exception of gravitation. The theory of generalized relativity leads to the law of gravitation and its relations with other natural forces. Since Greek antiquity, it has been well known that to describe the movement of a body, it is necessary to resort to the movement of another body to which the movement of the first refers. The movement of a car is referred to the sun, the movement of a planet to the totality of the visible fixed stars. In physics, the bodies to which the phenomena refer spatially are indicated by the name of coordinate systems. The laws of mechanics of Galileo and Newton can only be formulated using a system of coordinates. But in order for the laws of mechanics to be valid, the state of motion of the coordinate system cannot be chosen at will. It must be rotationless and accelerationless. An admissible coordinate system in mechanics is called an inertia system. However, the state of motion of a system of inertia is not, according to mechanics, clearly determined by nature. Rather, we must say, a coordinate system which moves in a straight line and with uniform motion relative to a system of inertia is also a system of inertia. By principle of restricted relativity is meant the extension of this proposition to any natural phenomenon. Every general law of nature, valid for a coordinate system, must be valid without change for a coordinate system, Q animated by a uniform motion of translation in relation to K. The second principle on which the theory of special relativity is based is the principle of the constancy of the speed of light in vacuum. This principle says, light always has, in a vacuum, a well-determined scattering speed, regardless of the state of motion and the light source. The credit given to this principle by the physicist is due to the successes of Lorentz's and Maxwell's electrodynamics. The two enunciated principles are powerfully supported by the experience, but they don't seem, logically, compatible among them. The theory of the restricted relativity has come finally to realize this logical union, modifying the kinematics. That is the doctrine of the laws concerning the space and the time, starting from the physical point of view. It has shown this. To say that two events are simultaneous has no meaning except in relation to a system of coordinates, and it is evident that the shape of the meters and the running of the clocks must depend on their state of motion in relation to the system of coordinates. But the ancient physics, including the laws of Galileo and Newton, did not adapt itself to this relativistic kinematics of which we have now spoken. From the latter descended the general mathematical conditions to which the natural laws had to correspond, if the two general principles enunciated were true. Physics had to adapt itself to them. In particular, a new law of motion was arrived at for rapidly moving material points, which was also verified exactly on electrically charged particles. The most important result of the theory of special relativity concerned the inert masses of a system of bodies. It was shown that the inertia of a system must depend on its energy content, and it was arrived, so to speak, at the conception that inert masses are nothing but latent energy. The principle of conservation of mass has lost its autonomy. It has merged with that of conservation of energy. The theory of special relativity, which is nothing else than the systematic prolongation of the coordinates introduced by us, and with their state of motion, opened new ways overcoming its own limits. Was not the independence of the physical laws in relation to the state of motion of the coordinate systems limited to the uniform motions of translation of the coordinate systems in relation to each other? What then has nature to do with the coordinate systems introduced by us and their state of motion? Even if it is necessary in order to describe nature to employ a coordinate system chosen at our pleasure, the choice of its state of motion should not, at least, be subject to no limitations whatsoever. The laws should be absolutely independent of this choice, principle of generalized relativity. The application of this principle of generalized relativity can be easily understood through an experience known for a long time, according to which the weight and the inertia of a body are governed by the same constant, equality of the heavy and inert masses. Let us imagine, for example, a coordinate system animated by a uniform rotational motion relative to a system of inertia in the Newtonian sense. The centrifugal forces that intervene, relative to this system, must be conceived, according to Newton's theory, as effects of the inertia. But these centrifugal forces are proportional to the mass of the bodies, exactly as the forces of gravity. Would it not be possible, under certain circumstances, to conceive the coordinate system as immobile and the centrifugal forces as gravitational forces? It is easy to conceive, but classical mechanics opposes it. This consideration made incidentally makes us present that a generalized theory of relativity must provide us with the laws of gravitation and the logical continuity of the idea to justify this hope. But the path was harder than could be foreseen because it demanded the abandonment of Euclid's geometry, which means the laws according to which solid bodies arrange themselves in space do not agree exactly with the spatial laws of Euclidean geometry. This is what is meant when we speak of the curvature of space. The fundamental concepts, the line, the plane, etc., thus lose in physics their exact meaning. In the theory of generalized relativity, the doctrine of space and time, kinematics, is no longer a foundation independent of the rest of physics. The behavior of bodies and the running of clocks depend rather on the fields of gravitation, which, in turn, are produced by matter. The new theory of gravitation departs considerably, as regards its principles, from Newton's theory, but its practical results agree so closely with those of this theory that it is difficult to find experimental evidence of appreciable differences. Here are the ones we've found so far. 1. The rotation of the ellipses of planetary orbits around the Sun, observed on Mercury. 2. The curvature of light rays through gravitation fields, observed on solar eclipse photographs. 3. A red shift in the spectral rays of light sent to us by stars of significant mass. The main merit of the theory is that it constitutes a logical whole. If only one of its consequences appeared inexact, it should be abandoned. Any change would be impossible without shaking the whole edifice. But no one must think that Newton's great creation can really be superseded by this or a similar theory. His great and clear ideas will always retain their eminent importance in the future, and it is upon them that we base all our modern speculations on the nature of the world, the space, the ether, and the field. Scientific reasoning is the refinement of pre-scientific thinking, since, in the latter, the idea of space already has a fundamental function. We must begin by studying this idea as it was at its origin before science. There are two ways of considering ideas. One and the other are indispensable for understanding. The first is the logical analytic method. It answers the question, in what way do ideas and judgments depend on each other? In answering this question, we find ourselves on relatively safe ground. It is the security that inspires in us so much respect for mathematics. But this security is acquired only at the price of deep content. Concepts do not acquire an inner fund unless they are bound up, even if indirectly, with the experiences of the senses. But this bond cannot be discovered through logical research. It can only be the aim of a vital action. And yet it is precisely this union that determines the value of the knowledge of conceptual systems. Example: an archaeologist of a future civilization finds a manual of Euclidean geometry without figures. He will understand well in what way the words point, line, plane are used in the theorems. He will also realize the process of deduction of these theorems from each other, and will also be able to establish new theorems according to the known rules. But the formation of theorems will remain for him a vain game of words, until he will be able to imagine something corresponding to the words point, line, plane, etc. Only then will geometry have a real foundation for him. The same thing will happen with analytical mechanics and in general with the logical deductive sciences. What do we mean by the expression to be able to imagine something with respect to the words point, line, intersection, etc.? It means to represent the content of experience to which these words correspond. This problem outside of logic constitutes the problem of real existence, which the archaeologist will only be able to solve through intuition, by classifying and examining his own experiences to see if he can discover anything in them that corresponds to those primitive words of the theory and to the axioms for which they were established. Only in this case can he rationally pose the question of the existence of a thing represented in the abstract. With the pre-scientific concepts of our thought, we find ourselves, so far as reality is concerned, more or less in the same situation as the archaeologist. We have, as it were, forgotten what features of the world of experience led us to the formation of these ideas, and we have considerable difficulty in depicting the world of vital perceptions without the spectacles of abstract interpretation to which we have long been accustomed. There is also the difficulty that our language must make use of words inextricably bound up with these primitive ideas. Such are the obstacles which bar our way when we wish to expound the reality of the prescientific idea of space. Before dealing with the problem of space, let us make a preliminary statement about ideas in general. Ideas refer to sense experiences, but can never be logically derived from them. For this reason, I have never been able to understand the question of the a priori in Kant's sense. In questions of reality, it can never be but a matter of one thing, namely of seeking the characters of the complex of sense experiences to which the ideas refer. As far as the idea of space is concerned, that of the corporeal object would seem to have to precede it. The formation of the complexes and impressions of the senses which may have given rise to this idea has often been described. The correspondence of certain impressions of touch and sight, the possibility of a continuous succession in time and of repetition of the sensations, touch, sight, whenever we wish, constitute some of these characteristics. If we have arrived, with the help of such precise experiences, at the idea of a corporeal object, which idea does not suppose at all the relation of space and time, the necessity of creating by thought the reciprocal relations between corporeal objects of this nature must inevitably give rise to ideas corresponding to their relations of space. Two bodies can touch each other or be separated. In the latter case, it is possible, without changing them at all, to place a third body between them. In the former, it is impossible. These relations of space are as manifestly real as the bodies themselves. If two bodies are equivalent to fill an interval of this kind, they are equally equivalent to fill another interval. The interval is therefore independent of the specific choice of the body intended to fill it, and this applies in general to the relations of space. It is evident that this independence, which is a prejudicial condition of the usefulness of the formation of purely geometrical ideas, is not an a priori necessity. It seems to me that above all this idea of the interval, inferred from the special choice of the body destined to fill it, constitutes the starting point of the idea of space. According to these brief reflections, the development of the idea of space, considered from the point of view of sense experience, seems to be represented by the following scheme. Corporeal object, relation of position of corporeal objects, interval, space. From this point of view, something as real as bodily objects appears. It is clear that in the world of ideas, outside science, the idea of space existed as a concept of a real thing, but Euclid's mathematics did not know this idea as such and made up for it by using the ideas of thing, of relations between things, only as auxiliary ideas. The point, the plane, the line, the distance are idealized corporeal objects. All relations of position are reduced to relations of contact, intersections of lines, planes, positions of points on lines, etc. In this concept, space as a continuum does not appear. It was Descartes who first introduced this concept by describing point space by means of its coordinates. Only then do we see geometric forms appear, as portions of infinite space, conceived as continuous in 3 dimensions. The great superiority of Cartesian theory does not consist only in the fact of having placed analysis at the service of geometry. In my opinion, the capital point is this. The geometry of the Greeks gives preference to certain forms, line, plane. Others, for example the ellipse, are not accessible to it except insofar as they are constructed or defined with the help of forms such as the point, the line, and the plane. In contrast, in the Cartesian doctrine all surfaces, for example, are equivalent in principle, and preference in geometrical construction is deliberately not given to linear form. If we consider geometry as the doctrine of the laws of the reciprocal position of practically rigid bodies, this science must be considered the most ancient branch of physics. It was able to develop, as we have already pointed out, without the idea of space as space, since it was content with ideal forms, bodies, points, lines, planes, distances. By contrast, Newton's physics necessarily needed space as a whole in Descartes' sense, because the concepts of material point, of distance between material points, varying with time, were not sufficient for dynamics. In particular, in Newton's equations of motion, the concept of acceleration has a fundamental part that cannot be defined solely by the distances between time-varying points. Newton's acceleration cannot be conceived or defined as acceleration in relation to the spatial whole. To the geometric reality of the concept of space, a new function of space that determines inertia is therefore added. When Newton affirmed that space is absolute, he was probably aiming at this real meaning of space, which for him implied the necessity of a well-defined state of movement, however not entirely determined by the phenomena of mechanics. On the other hand, this space was conceived as absolute from another point of view. Its determining effect of inertia was considered as independent, i.e., it was not influenced by any physical circumstances. It acted on the masses, but inversely nothing acted on it. And yet, in the consciousness of physicists, space, until recent times, remained exclusively as a passive vessel of all events, without participating in any way. It was necessary the undulatory theory of light and that of the electromagnetic field of Maxwell and Faraday to give a new direction to ideas. It became then manifest that, in the space deprived of material bodies, there are states propagated through undulations and localized fields susceptible to exercise dynamic actions on the electric masses or on the magnetic poles that are there. But since to the physicists of the 19th century, it seemed quite absurd to attribute to space itself physical functions or states, they imagined on the model of ponderable matter, a medium that permeated all space and was the support of the luminous phenomena, the ether. The states of this medium, which had to be the electromagnetic fields, were imagined to be of mechanical nature, comparable to the elastic deformations of solid bodies. But the development of this mechanical theory of the ether did not give entirely good results, so that people slowly became accustomed to renounce to interpret in a more precise way the nature of the fields of the ether. It is so that the ether became a quid, whose only function consisted in serving as a support for electric fields that could not be further analyzed. The picture was consequently as follows. The ether fills space, and in the ether, material corpuscles, i.e. the atoms of ponderable matter, wander. The atomic structure of matter had already, at the beginning of the century, become a definitely acquired result. Since the reciprocal action of bodies had to take place through fields, there had to be also in the ether a field of gravitation. But the law of this field had not yet taken at this epoch a definite form. The ether was considered as the seat of all dynamic actions capable of making themselves felt at a distance through space. Since it was recognized that electric masses in motion produced a magnetic field, of which the energy gave a model for the inertia also as a field action, located in the ether. But it was above all in the mechanical properties of the ether that dark points were to be found, and it was then that the great discovery of H.A. Lorentz. All the phenomena of electromagnetism known until then were justified by two hypotheses. The ether is rigidly bound to space, that is, in essence, it cannot move. Electricity is rigidly bound to elementary particles in motion. We can now enunciate Lorentz's discovery in this way. Physical space and the ether are but two different expressions of one and the same thing. Fields are physical states of space. In fact, if one does not attribute to the ether any particular state of motion, there is no reason to make it appear next to space as an entity of special nature. But this way of seeing was still far from the thinking of physicists, because they considered space as something rigid, homogeneous, not susceptible of any change. Only the genius of Riemann, isolated and misunderstood, arrived towards the middle of the last century, at the conception of a new idea of space which denied its rigidity and recognized as possible its participation in physical events. This creation of thought, due to Riemann, is all the more worthy of admiration because it was prior to the electric field theory of Faraday and Maxwell. Later came the theory of special relativity that recognized the physical equivalence of all inert systems, which demonstrated, together with electrodynamics or the law of light propagation, the indissolubility of space and time. Until then, it had been implicitly admitted that the four-dimensional continuum in the sphere of experience can objectively divide itself into space and time. That is, that the word now, in the world of facts, has an absolute meaning. The moment relativity had recognized its simultaneity. Space and time had merged into one indivisible continuum, just as before the three dimensions of space had merged into such a continuum. Physical space was thus completed by becoming a four-dimensional space that also included the dimension of time. The four-dimensional space of the theory of special relativity is just as rigid and absolute as Newton's space. The theory of relativity is a superb and peculiar example of the development of modern scientific thought. The fact is that non-unitary hypotheses become more and more abstract, more and more remote from experience. With the theory of relativity, it comes closest to the scientific aim par excellence, which is to embrace by logical deduction, by means of a minimum of hypotheses and axioms, a maximum of experimental content. In this way, the thought that, starting from the axioms, penetrates the content of the experiences or verifies its own conclusions becomes more and more logical and subtle. In the search for theories, the theorist is forced to be guided more and more by purely mathematical formulations, because the experimental physicist as such cannot rise to these domains of the highest abstraction. In place of the predominantly inductive method of science, which corresponds to its youth, there appears, groping, deduction. But such a theoretical edifice must be extremely perfected down to the smallest details in order to lead to results comparable with those of experience. Undoubtedly, even here, the experimental fact is the omnipossible guide, but its verdict is only applicable on the basis of a powerful and delicate work, which has in the first place established the bonds between the axioms and the verifiable effects. And the theorist must perform this gigantic work with the clear consciousness that he is perhaps called upon to justify the death sentence of his theory. The theorist who undertakes this study is not to be blamed for being over-imaginative. On the contrary, his imagination must be proved, for, all things considered, there is no other way for him to arrive at his goal. In any case, it is not an imagination without design, but a research carried out in view of logically simpler possibilities and their consequences. This appeal to benevolence was necessary in order to better dispose the reader to follow with interest the concatenation of the ideas that follow. That is the course of the ideas that has led from the theory of the restricted relativity to the theory of the generalized relativity, and beyond the last step of this theory, to the theory of the unitary field. In this exposition, it is absolutely impossible for me to avoid altogether the use of mathematical symbols. Let's start with special relativity. This too is directly based on an empirical law of the constancy of the speed of light. Let P be a point in vacuum, P a point whose distance from P, d, is infinitely small. Let us admit that a light emission starts from P at the instant t and arrives at P in the time t plus dt. It is then had ds c2 to dt2 b dx1 dx2 dx3, the orthogonal projections of ds, if we introduce the imaginary time coordinate ct 1 twice or x4. The law of constancy of light propagation takes shape: ds2 plus dx12 plus dx22 plus dx33 plus d4 rise rho. Since this formula expresses a real meaning, one must attribute to dA a real meaning, even in the case in which the neighboring points of the four-dimensional continuum are chosen in such a way that the corresponding ds does not cancel. This is expressed approximately as follows. The four-dimensional space, with the imaginary coordinate of time, of the theory of special relativity, has a Euclidean metric. This is how we explain that this metric is Euclidean. Introducing such a metric in a three-dimensional continuum leads to referring to the axioms of Euclid's geometry. In this case, the equation expressing the metric is none other than Pythagoras' theorem applied to coordinate differentials. In the theory of special relativity, one can make the coordinates undergo, by means of a transformation, modifications of such a nature, that the value ds, fundamental constant, is also expressed in the new differentials of coordinates, with the sum of squares. These transformations are called Lorentz transformations. The heuristic method employed by the theory of special relativity is characterized by the following proposition. In order to express natural laws, one must admit only equations whose form does not vary when the coordinates are changed by means of a Lorentz transformation. Covariance of equations with respect to Lorentz transformations. It is thanks to this method that the unavoidable link between impulse and energy, between magnetic and electric field strengths, between electrostatic and electrodynamic forces, between inert mass and energy was known. With this fact, the number of independent notions and fundamental equations of physics was decreased. This method has exceeded its own limits. Is it true that the equations of natural laws are covariant only with respect to Lorentz transformations, and not with respect to other transformations? Put in these terms, the question has, to tell the truth, no sense, because every system of equations can be expressed with general coordinates. We must put it this way. Are the natural laws such that the choice of any particular coordinates does not cause only essential simplifications? Let it be said incidentally, our axiom, founded on experience, of the identity of the inert and heavy masses, facilitates the affirmative answer to this question. If we raise to a principle the equivalence of attitude of all coordinate systems in allowing the formulation of the laws of nature, we arrive at the theory of generalized relativity, provided we maintain the principle of the constancy of the speed of light, or the hypothesis of the objective meaning of the Euclidean metric, at least for infinitely small portions of the four-dimensional space. This means that, for finite portions of space, we assume the existence, in the physical sense of the term, of a general Riemann metric according to the formula ds2 sgmu dxmi dxy, in which the summation brings on all combinations indices from 1.1 to 4.4. In only one point, moreover essential, the structure of such a space differs from the Euclidean space. The coefficients gmu are provisionally any functions of the coordinates x1, x4, and the structure of the space is not really determined that when these gmu functions are actually known. In itself, the structure of such a space is completely indeterminate, and it does not become determined that when we indicate the three functions to which the metric field of the GMU satisfies. It is in this way that, for reasons of physical order, the conviction was maintained that the metric field was at the same time a field of gravitation. Since the field of gravitation is determined by the configuration of masses and varies with them, the geometric structure of this space also depends on factors pertaining to physics. According to this theory, space is no longer absolute, exactly as Riemann had predicted it, but its structure depends on physical influences. Geometry, physics, is no longer an isolated science, closed in on itself like Euclid's geometry. The problem of gravitation has thus been reduced to a mathematical problem. One must look for the simplest equations of condition, immutable with respect to any transformation of coordinates. It is a well-defined problem, the solution of which is possible. I shall not say anything here about the experimental verification of this theory, but I want to say at once why the theory could not declare itself definitely satisfied with the result. Undoubtedly, gravitation has been brought back to the structure of space, but outside the field of gravitation, there is still the electromagnetic field. It has been necessary to introduce this last into the theory as a formation independent of gravitation. In the condition equation for the field, it was necessary to introduce some additional terms corresponding to the existence of the electromagnetic field. But the theoretical thought could not bear the idea that there are two structures of space independent of each other, one of metric gravitation, the other electromagnetic. the conviction imposes itself that these two species of field must correspond to a unitary structure of space. Now, the unitary field theory, which presents itself as a mathematically independent extension of the theory of generalized relativity, tries to answer this last postulate. Formally, the problem must be posed in these terms. Is there a theory of the continuum in which, alongside the metric, there is a new element of structure that forms a whole with the metric? If so, what are the simplest laws of the field to which a continuum of this nature can be subjected? And finally, can these field laws agree to represent the property of the gravitation field and the electromagnetic field? To this is still added the question whether corpuscles, electrons and protons, can be conceived as particularly dense zones of field, whose motions are determined by the field equations. In this expectation, there is but one answer to the three first questions. The fundamental space structure is described as follows and applies to a space of any number of dimensions. Space has a Riemann metric. This means that in the infinitesimal surroundings of every point P, Euclidean geometry is applicable. Consequently, there exists in the surroundings of every point P a local Cartesian system of coordinates with respect to which the metric is computed according to the Pythagorean theorem. If we suppose to carry the length on the positive axis of this local system, we will have the local orthogonal n-hedron, and there is also a local n-hedron of every other point P of the space. If, starting from the points P and P, we draw a line section, PG or PG, we can, by means of a corresponding local n-hedron, starting from its local coordinates, calculate, with the Pythagorean theorem, the value of each of these line sections. Consequently, to speak of numerical equality of the line sections PG and PG has a well-defined meaning. Now, it is essential to observe that the local orthogonal n-edra are not completely determined by the metric, since one can still freely choose the orientation of the individual local n-edra without modifying the result in the calculation of the values of the line segments according to the Pythagorean theorem. From this it follows, in a space whose structure exists exclusively in a Riemann metric, that two traits PG and PG can compare with each other in magnitude but not in direction. In particular, declaring that two elements are parallel to each other does not make any sense. From this point of view, the pure metric space of Riemann is poorer in structure than that of Euclid. Since we are looking for a space richer in structure than the Riemann space, it is easy to enrich the latter with the structure of the direction relation, or of parallelism. To each direction passing through P, we consequently make correspond a given direction passing through P with a univocal reciprocal relation. We call these two directions referred to each other parallel. To this relation of parallelism, we also follow the condition of conservation of angles. Let PG or PR be two directions passing through P, PG and PR, the corresponding parallel directions passing through P. Then the angles RPG and RPG, measurable in local systems according to the Euclidean theory, are equal to each other. In this way, the structure of space taken as a basis is completely defined. Its simplest mathematical description can be done as follows. We make a local orthogonal n-hedron of a given orientation chosen at will pass through point P. At every other point P of the space, we orient the local n-hedron so that its axes are parallel to the axes corresponding to the point P. In this way, with the given structure of the space and the freely chosen orientation of the n-hedron passing through a single point P, all the n-hedra are completely determined. Let us now imagine in the space P any Gauss coordinate system, and on this system, at each point, let us project the axis of the n-hedron in question. The set of these n2 components completely describes the structure of the space. This structure of space lies, so to speak, between Riemann's structure and Euclid's structure. Contrary to the former, we find ourselves in a straight line, that is, a line in which all segments are parallel to each other 2 by 2. The theory described above is distinguished from the Euclidean theory by the non-existence of the parallelogram. If for the extremities P and G of a line PG, two equal and parallel lines PP and GG are passed, PG is, in general, neither equal nor parallel to PG. The mathematical problem already solved so far is now this. What are the simplest conditions to which a space structuring of the described nature can be subjected? The main question to be studied is still this. To what extent can elementary physical fields and forms be represented by singularity-free solutions of the equations that answer this question? Origin of the theory of generalized relativity. Some historical information about my scientific work. It is not that I unduly overestimate the importance of my effort, but to describe the history of the work of others supposes an investigation into the thought of others, which is rather the task of personalities exercised in historical work, while to give explanations of one's own previous thoughts would seem incomparably easier. One is here in a far more favorable situation, and one must not, out of modesty, let the opportunity pass. When, with the theory of special relativity, the equivalence of all the systems of inertia was obtained to formulate the laws of nature, 1905, the problem of knowing if there was a more extended equivalence among the coordinate systems arose almost spontaneously. In other words, if we can only attribute a relative meaning to the idea of velocity, should we nevertheless insist on considering acceleration as an absolute concept? Starting from a purely kinematic point of view, the relativity of any movements could certainly not be doubted, but physically a special importance seemed to have to be attributed to the system of inertia, and this privileged significance made the use of coordinate systems moving in a different way seem artificial. Doubtless I was familiar with Mach's conception, according to which it seemed reasonable to suppose that the resistance of inertia did not oppose an acceleration in itself, but an acceleration referred to the masses of the other bodies in the world. This idea exercised on my mind I know not what fascination, but it offered me no useful principle for a new theory. I first made a step towards the solution of the problem when I tried to consider the law of gravitation in the framework of the theory of special relativity. Like most of the authors of this epoch, I tried to establish a field law for gravitation, since it was no longer possible, after the suppression of the idea of absolute simultaneity, to introduce an immediate action at a distance, or at least it was no longer possible in any natural way. The simplest thing was, of course, to maintain Laplace's scalar potential of gravitation, and to complete Poisson's equation in a way easy to conceive, with a term differentiated in relation to time, so that the law of special relativity was given satisfaction. It was also necessary to adapt to this theory the law of motion of the material point in the field of gravitation. For this, the way to follow was less clearly indicated, because the inert mass of a body could depend on the potential of gravitation. It was also necessary to take it into account in homage to the theorem of the inertia of energy. But such researches led me to a result that made me distrustful to the highest degree. According to classical mechanics, the vertical acceleration of a body in the vertical weight field is independent of the horizontal component of the velocity. Moreover, the vertical acceleration of a mechanical system, or of its center of gravity in this weight field, is produced independently of its internal kinetic energy. But, according to the theory under study, it was not the acceleration of fall in relation to the horizontal velocity or the internal energy of a system. This did not agree with the ancient experience, namely, that bodies in a field of gravitation all undergo the same acceleration. This axiom, which may also be formulated as that of the equality of inert and heavy masses, appeared to me then in its profound significance. I was extremely surprised at its existence and imagined that it must contain the key to a deeper penetration of inertia and gravitation. Although I was ignorant of the results of the beautiful experiments of GreatWorks, who, if I remember well, I did not know until later, I did not seriously doubt the strong validity of this axiom. It was then that I rejected as inadequate the attempt, of which I have spoken above, to treat the problem of gravitation in the framework of restricted relativity. This framework manifestly did not agree with the most important property of gravitation. The axiom of the equality of the inert and heavy masses could now be formulated in a very expressive way, in this way. In a field of homogeneous gravitation, all movements are produced analogously to what happens in the absence of a field of uniform gravitation. If this principle was valid for any phenomenon, principle of equivalence, it was a proof that the principle of relativity had to be extended to coordinate systems in relative non-uniform motion if one wished to arrive at a theory of gravitation without considerable difficulty. These reflections occupied me from 1908 to 1911, and I tried to draw from them certain special consequences, of which I shall not speak here. The only important thing, first of all, was to have recognized that it was not possible to arrive at a rational theory of gravitation except by extending the principle of relativity. It was consequently convenient to establish a theory whose equations would preserve their form even with nonlinear transformations of coordinates. Now, I did not know at that time if this should apply to any continuous transformations, or only to some. I soon realized that by admitting, in conformity with the requirements of the principle of equivalence, nonlinear transformations, the simply physical interpretation of coordinates was destined to disappear. That is to say that one could no longer pretend that the differences in coordinates represented immediate results of measurements made by means of meters or ideal clocks. This realization embarrassed me greatly, because it was no longer possible for me to understand, in essence, what meaning should then be attributed to coordinates in physics. I did not come to resolve this dilemma until 1912, according to the following considerations. However, it was necessary to find a new way of formulating the law of inertia, which, in the case of the absence of an effective gravitational field when using a system of inertia, was transformed, as a system of coordinates, into the Galilean definition of the principle of inertia. The latter says, a material point on which no force acts is represented in the four-dimensional system by a straight line, i.e., by the strongest line, or, more correctly, by an extremal line. This concept assumes the idea of the length of a line segment, i.e., a metric. In the theory of special relativity, this metric was, as Minkowski had shown, a quasi-Euclidean metric in the sense that the square of the length of the line segment was a quadratic function determined by the differentials of the coordinates. Now, if we introduce with a nonlinear transformation other coordinates, ds2 remains a homogeneous function of coordinate differentials, but the coefficients of this function, gmi, are no longer constant. They are functions of coordinates. In mathematical language, we will say physical space, with four dimensions, possesses a Riemann metric. The extremal lines of this metric, which have an affinity with time, give the law of motion of a material point that does not undergo, outside the forces of gravitation, the action of any force. The coefficients GMI of this metric described at the same time in relation to the chosen coordinate system the field of gravitation. Thus a natural statement of the principle of equivalence had been found, whose extension to any field of gravitation constituted an absolutely natural hypothesis. Here then was the solution of the above dilemma. It is not the differentials of coordinates, it is only the Riemann metric, to which they refer, that carries a physical meaning. In this way, a principle usable for the theory of generalized relativity was possessed. But there were still two problems to be solved. 1. When a field law is expressed according to the theory of special relativity, how should we transfer it to the case of a Riemann metric? 2. How to state the differential laws that determine the metric itself, i.e. the GMI of Riemann. I worked on these problems from 1912 to 1914 with my friend Grossman. We found that the mathematical procedures for solving problem 1 could be found stated in the infinitesimal differential calculus of Ricci and Levi-Civita. To solve problem 2, the invariable differential second-order forms of GME were manifestly needed. We soon saw that these had already been established by Riemann. 2 years before the publication of the theory of general relativity, we had already considered the correct equations of gravitation, but we could not face their use from the physical point of view. I thought I knew, on the contrary, that they could not agree with experience. In this connection, I also believed I could demonstrate, basing myself on general considerations, that an invariable law of gravitation, relating to transformations of coordinates chosen at will, does not agree with the principle of causality. Such were the errors that cost me 2 years of very hard work, until, towards the end of 1915, I realized these errors and discovered the connection with the facts of astronomical experience after I had returned, disheartened and confused, to the Riemann curvature. Enlightened by the knowledge already gathered, the happily attained goal appeared almost evident, and every intelligent scholar understood it without much effort. But these researches, full of forebodings, pursued in the shadows for long years, that ardent desire to attain the goal, those alternatives of confidence and weariness, that sudden burst of luminous truth, all this, in short, can only be truly known by the one who has experienced it. As I See the World by Albert Einstein